If you've ever stood
I just
over a
don't get
wilting, yellowing, struggling
look
container plant and quietly told yourself, I just don't have a green thumb, I want you to stop right there, because I need you to hear something important. That is almost never true. In nearly every case I have seen in decades of growing food and flowers in pots, tubs, grow bags, and raised containers,
From grow
the real
bags
problem
to
isn't the
terracotta,
gardener.
explore the
It's a
best
handful of
systems for your
small,
Potting mix is
hidden
light
mistakes.
and fluffy, but garden
Mistakes
soil is
so
dense
common,
and
so quietly accepted as just how container gardening is, that almost nobody questions them until it's too late. Here's what makes this so heartbreaking. These mistakes don't usually show up right away. A plant can look perfectly fine for weeks. It can
Growing
even
your
put
own
out a few
food is a
leaves,
dream.
a flower or two, maybe a small handful of fruit, all while a slow, invisible
just don't get
process
it.
is working against
The
it
roots look
underground, inside the container, hidden from view. By the time the leaves start yellowing, or the stems go limp, or the harvest
Why
comes
do
in
some
small
plants
and
thrive while
disappointing,
others struggle?
the damage has often been building for a very long time. The plant
From grow
isn't
bags
failing
to terracotta,
because you don't have
explore the best
the
systems
touch.
for your
Potting mix
It's
is
failing
light and fluffy,
because of a
but
decision
garden
made
soil
weeks
is dense
or
and
even months earlier. The size of the pot, the mix poured into it, whether water can actually escape from the bottom. Over the next couple of hours, we are going to walk through 15 of the most damaging container gardening mistakes, one at a time, in
growing
real
your own
depth.
food is a dream.
Not a quick checklist, not a surface-level listicle, a genuine sit-down masterclass.
I just don't get it.
The kind of conversation
The
I
roots
wish
look
someone had sat me down and had with me decades ago, before I killed my fair share of tomatoes, blueberries, and citrus trees, learning these
Why do some
lessons the
plants
hard
thrive
way.
while others struggle?
And I'll tell you now, the mistake that lands at the very top of this
From
list,
grow bags
the
to
one we'll get
terracotta,
to eventually,
explore the best
surprises
systems for your
even
Potting mix
gardeners
is light
who have
and
been
fluffy,
growing in
but garden
containers
soil
for
is
20 or
dense and
30 years. It's subtle, it's sneaky, and once you see it, you will never unsee it in your own garden. But we are going to earn our way there, one mistake at a time, building the foundation of understanding you need, so that when we finally reach it, it
Growing
clicks
your
into
own
place
food
completely.
is a dream.
So, settle in, get comfortable, maybe grab a cup of tea or coffee.
I just don't get
because
it.
we have a lot of
roots look
wonderful, practical, plant-saving ground to cover together. Container gardening has quietly become one of the most popular ways to grow food
Why do some
and
plants
flowers
thrive while others
anywhere
struggle?
in the world, and for very good reason. You don't need acres of land.
grow bags
you
to
don't need a
terracotta,
tiller, a
explore
tractor,
the best systems
or even
for
a
your
traditional
Potting mix is light
backyard,
and fluffy,
a sunny
but garden
balcony,
soil is
a
dense
concrete
and
patio, a rooftop, a set of porch steps, even a bright windowsill. All of these can become productive, beautiful growing spaces when you understand how to work with containers rather than against them. But here is something that trips up even experienced
own
ground
food is a
gardeners
dream.
when they move into pots and raised containers for the first time. Container gardening
I just
does
don't
not
get
play
it.
by the same rules
The roots
as
look
gardening in
healthy.
the open ground. In the ground, soil is part of a vast, connected ecosystem. Water that drains past the root zone doesn't
Why do
disappear.
some plants thrive
it
while
moves
others struggle?
sideways and downward through an enormous volume of earth,
From grow
buffered by
bags to
billions of soil
terracotta,
organisms,
explore the best
deep
systems
mineral
for your
Potting
reserves,
mix is
and
light
a
and
web of
fluffy,
fungal
but
networks
garden soil is
stretching in
dense and
every
com-
direction. Temperature swings slowly because the sheer mass of surrounding soil acts like insulation. Roots that need more space simply grow outward and downward, seeking it out. None of that safety net exists in a container. A
Growing
pot
your own
is an
food
island.
is a dream.
Whatever soil, water, nutrients, and living organisms exist inside
just
that
don't get it.
container are the entire
roots look
world
healthy.
available to that plant's root system. Nothing more. Roots that hit the wall of the pot cannot simply keep growing outward like they would in the ground.
Why do some plants
Water that
thrive
doesn't
while
drain
others
properly
struggle?
doesn't move away. It sits, saturating the same
From grow
small
bags
volume
to
of soil
terracotta,
the roots are trying to
explore
breathe
the
in.
best systems for your
Temperature
Potting
swings
mix
are
is
dramatic
light and fluffy,
because a
but garden
plastic
soil
or
is
terracotta
dense and
container exposed to sun and wind heats and cools far faster than the earth ever would. Every single decision you make, the size of the pot, the mix you fill it with, how you water, when you feed, how you position it, has an outsized effect.
Growing
Because
your
there is
own
no
food
larger
is a
system
dream.
to buffer your mistakes. That is precisely why container gardening rewards understanding so much more than instinct.
From grow bags
And
to
that is
terracotta,
exactly what we are going to
explore
build
the best
together
systems for your-
throughout this documentary. A genuine, working understanding of what container plants actually need, mistake by mistake, so that by the end, you will be able to look at any struggling potted plant
just don't get it.
and immediately recognize
The roots
what's
look
actually going wrong. Before we continue, if you're finding this valuable already, I'd love
Growing
it
your own
if you'd
food
consider
is a
subscribing
dream.
to the channel and tapping that thumbs up button. It genuinely helps this kind of in-depth, no-nonsense gardening education reach more people who need it, and it costs you nothing but a second of your
From
time.
grow bags to
And I do want to
terracotta,
encourage you
explore
to
the
stay
best
with me
systems for
all
your
the way
Potting
through,
mix is light and fluffy,
because the mistakes
but
we're
garden
building
soil is
toward,
dense and
including that surprising number one, are the ones that quietly undo even the most dedicated, well-intentioned gardeners. Understanding them
Growing your
could
own
genuinely
food is a
transform
dream.
how successful your container garden becomes. All right, let's get started. Mistake 15, choosing the wrong container size. Let's start at the very beginning, because this mistake happens before a single seed or seedling ever touches soil. Choosing the wrong container size means selecting a pot, tub, grow bag, or raised planter that doesn't match what the plant you're growing will actually need, either now or as it matures. And I want to be clear from the outset, this mistake runs in both directions. Most people assume wrong size only means too small, and we'll spend plenty of time on that because it is the more common error. But choosing a container that's too large for a plant is a real and damaging mistake too, one that catches thoughtful, well-meaning gardeners completely off guard because it seems like the generous, safe choice. It isn't, and I'll explain exactly why shortly. This mistake is almost always rooted in one very human, very understandable habit: shopping for the plant you have today, not the plant it's going to become in 6 or 8 weeks. You bring home a tomato seedling that's 4 inches tall with 2 sets of true leaves, and it looks almost comical sitting in anything bigger than a coffee cup. So you reach for something modest, a gallon pot, maybe a bit more if you're being cautious, because that seedling looks so small, and a bigger container feels excessive, wasteful, even a little silly. The trouble is, that seedling is not going to stay 4 inches tall. That same tomato plant, given the right conditions, is going to grow into a sprawling plant 3, 4, sometimes 6 feet tall, with a root system that wants to occupy 15, 20, even 25 gallons of soil volume by the time it's flowering and fruiting heavily in midsummer. Nobody sets out to strangle their tomato plant. They simply match the container to what they saw in front of them on planting day, not to what that variety needs at full maturity. The opposite mistake, going oversized, usually comes from a completely different, equally understandable impulse. Bigger must be better, or I don't want to have to repot this later, so I'll just start big. I understand the appeal of that logic completely. Nobody enjoys the disruption of transplanting a plant that's settling in nicely. But as we're about to explore, that impulse to overplan by going enormous right out of the gate creates a very specific set of problems that are just as damaging as going too small, just in a different, quieter way. Gardeners who have been doing this for years have usually learned, often through a season or two of frustrating results, that container size is not a minor detail you can eyeball. It is one of the single biggest levers determining whether a plant thrives or merely survives. Experienced growers think in terms of mature root volume, not current plant size. They ask, what will this plant's root system need at full size in peak summer heat, producing its heaviest harvest? And they size the container to that answer, not to the small seedling sitting in front of them on planting day. They've also learned, often the hard way, that both directions of this mistake, too small and too large, create very real, very different problems, and that there's a genuine sweet spot for every type of plant that balances root development, water management, and practical considerations like weight and space. Let's really dig into the why here, because understanding the science transforms this from a rule you follow blindly into a principle you can apply confidently to any plant you ever grow. In open ground, a plant's root system grows in response to need. When roots encounter resistance or run out of easily accessible water and nutrients in one area, they simply extend further, seeking new territory. This is why a mature oak tree's root system can spread far wider than its canopy. Roots are opportunistic and expansive by nature. In a container, that expansive tendency runs headlong into a hard physical wall, literally, the wall of the pot. When roots reach that boundary, they can't keep growing outward in a straight line seeking new soil. Instead, they begin to change direction, following the inside curve of the container. This is called root circling, and it is one of the most important concepts in all of container gardening. A plant, in a too small container for its size, will develop a root system that spirals around and around the inside edge of the pot, essentially strangling itself. Roots crossing over and pressing against other roots restrict each other's ability to take up water and nutrients, and in severe, long-term cases, this circling pattern can literally girdle the plant, cutting off its own vascular flow much the way a tight belt would restrict circulation. Beyond circling, a root-bound plant simply runs out of physical volume to explore. Roots are constantly seeking three things: water, mineral nutrients, and oxygen. Yes, roots need to breathe. More on that in a moment. In a container that's too small, the total volume of soil available to search through is limited, meaning the roots exhaust the available water and nutrients faster than in a properly sized container, and the gardener has to compensate with dramatically more frequent watering and feeding just to keep the plant limping along. Every container, regardless of size, holds a finite volume of potting mix, and that mix is the plant's entire nutrient and water reservoir. A larger volume of soil acts as a buffer. It holds more water in reserve between waterings, it holds more available nutrients, and it maintains more stable moisture and temperature conditions throughout the day. A smaller volume of soil has almost no buffering capacity at all. It can go from adequately moist to bone dry in the space of a single hot afternoon, especially in a dark-colored plastic pot sitting on a sun-baked patio. This is precisely why undersized containers create what I call the constant crisis cycle. The plant is perpetually oscillating between drought stress and, if the gardener overcorrects by watering too often to compensate, waterlogged stress. Neither extreme allows the plant to settle into the steady, even conditions it needs to grow strong roots, healthy foliage, and abundant fruit. Here's something that surprises a lot of beginner gardeners. Soil isn't just solid particles. Good potting mix is actually a complex, three-dimensional structure full of tiny air pockets between particles of bark, peat, coconut coir, perlite, and other components. These air pockets are absolutely essential because plant roots need oxygen just as much as they need water. They respire, taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide, exactly like the leaves do in reverse. In an undersized container, the ratio of roots to soil particles skews dramatically over time. As the root mass expands to fill nearly the entire volume of the pot, it physically displaces the air pockets that would otherwise exist between soil particles. Water that's applied has fewer channels to drain through and less total soil surface area to be absorbed by, so it tends to pool, and the remaining, shrinking pockets of air get squeezed out by both the roots and the retained water. The result is a suffocating, low-oxygen root zone, even though the gardener is doing everything else right. Water movement. Water movement through a container follows gravity and capillary action together. In a well-sized container, with a healthy volume of properly structured potting mix, water applied at the top moves evenly downward, wetting the whole root zone, and then drains cleanly out the bottom, leaving the mix moist but not saturated, with air able to be pulled back into the pore spaces as the water recedes. In an undersized, root-bound container, this even movement breaks down. Water tends to channel through the few remaining gaps and cracks between the packed root mass, sometimes running straight through and out the drainage holes without ever properly wetting the compacted root ball at all. A phenomenon experienced gardeners call hydrophobic channeling. You can water a severely root-bound container plant generously and still leave large sections of the root ball essentially dry, because the water simply found the path of least resistance and left. Nutrient availability. Nutrients in potting mix exist in limited supply and are also delivered through whatever fertilizer program you're using. In a small container, this limited nutrient reservoir gets exhausted far faster, simply because there's less total soil volume holding on to those nutrient ions between fertilizer applications. A tomato plant in a 5-gallon container versus one in a 20-gallon container, given identical fertilizer schedules, will run through available nutrients far more quickly in the smaller pot, leading to nutrient deficiencies that show up as pale leaves, poor fruit set, and stunted growth, even though the gardener is technically feeding on schedule. This is a piece that even many intermediate gardeners overlook. Healthy potting mix, especially mix that has matured over a growing season or been inoculated with beneficial organisms, hosts a living community of beneficial bacteria and fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi, in particular, form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, essentially extending the root system's effective reach and improving water and nutrient uptake dramatically. These beneficial populations need a certain volume of stable, aerated, moderately moist soil to establish and thrive. In an undersized container experiencing wild swings between drought and waterlogging, these beneficial populations struggle to establish at all, denying the plant one of its most valuable natural allies. Long before a plant collapses, it gives you signals, quiet ones at first, if you know what to look for. With an undersized container, the earliest sign is usually a change in watering frequency. If you notice you're suddenly watering a container every single day, sometimes even twice a day during hot weather, when just a few weeks earlier it needed water only every 2 or 3 days, that's often your first clue the roots have filled the available soil volume and are no longer leaving much buffer capacity. Another early sign is slightly wilted foliage in the heat of the afternoon that fully recovers by evening or the next morning. This temporary, recoverable wilting is the plant telling you its root system can no longer keep pace with water loss through the leaves during peak heat, even though overnight recovery makes it easy to dismiss as normal. As the problem progresses, you'll start to see roots emerging from the drainage holes at the bottom of the container. Sometimes a thick, tangled mat of them. You might also notice the entire root ball has become so dense that when you finally do remove the plant to check, which I'll walk you through shortly, the potting mix is barely visible at all, replaced almost entirely by a tight, circling mass of roots holding the exact shape of the container, even after you remove it. Growth will visibly slow or stall. Flowering and fruiting will become sparse and undersized compared to what the variety should typically produce. Lower leaves may yellow and drop even when nutrients are being supplied, because the plant simply cannot move water and nutrients efficiently through a strangled, oxygen-starved root system. Left unaddressed, a chronically undersized container creates a plant that never reaches anywhere close to its genetic potential. Yields on vegetables and fruits are dramatically reduced. Flowering plants bloom weakly and briefly. Perennial plants and shrubs, which might otherwise live for many years in a properly sized container, become increasingly stressed and vulnerable to pest infestations and disease, because a chronically stressed plant's natural defenses are compromised, much the way a chronically run-down immune system in a person becomes more susceptible to illness. In severe, prolonged cases, the plant simply dies, not from any single dramatic event, but from the slow, cumulative toll of never having had enough room to develop the root system it needed to support healthy top growth. Let's clear up a few things I hear constantly. Myth number 1. A bigger pot will overwhelm a small plant and cause root rot. This is one of the most persistent pieces of gardening folklore, and while there's a kernel of truth buried in it, it's usually misapplied and misunderstood. And I'm going to walk you through the real mechanism behind it in a moment, because the actual risk isn't what most people think it is. Myth number 2. You should always start with the biggest container you can afford, so you never have to repot. As we're about to discuss, this creates its own distinct set of problems, particularly for young seedlings. Myth number 3. Pot size doesn't matter much, as long as you water and fertilize enough. This one is especially costly, because as we just covered in detail, no amount of watering or fertilizing can fully compensate for insufficient root volume. You can't feed your way out of a physical space constraint. Now let's address the other direction properly, because I promised you I would, and it deserves real explanation rather than a dismissive one-liner. When you plant a small seedling directly into a very large container, the actual danger isn't that the big pot will drown the little plant in some vague, mystical sense. The real, specific mechanism is this. A large volume of potting mix holds a large volume of water, and a small seedling's modest root system can only draw moisture from a relatively small area immediately surrounding it. The vast majority of soil in that oversized container, far from the seedling's limited root reach, stays consistently moist for a much longer period after each watering, simply because there's so much more of it and so little root activity to draw it down. This persistently damp, underutilized soil, sitting largely undisturbed by root activity, becomes an environment where fungal pathogens that cause root rot and damping off disease can establish and spread far more easily than they would in a smaller container, where the entire soil volume is being actively used and cycled through by an appropriately sized root system. It's not that the size itself is dangerous. It's that the mismatch between root activity and soil volume creates prolonged dampness in a large percentage of the pot. And prolonged dampness is exactly what root rot-causing fungi need to thrive. There's also a practical, purely physical consideration with oversized containers: weight and mobility. A large container filled with moist potting mix is remarkably heavy, sometimes 50, 80, over 100 pounds depending on size, which makes seasonal repositioning, protecting plants from frost, or simply rearranging your growing space far more physically demanding than it needs to be, particularly for gardeners for whom mobility and ease of movement matter. Picture this with me. Take a young tomato seedling, roughly 6 inches tall, and place it, still in its nursery pot, in the center of a 5-gallon container. Notice how the root ball occupies only a small fraction of that container's total volume, maybe 10%. Now imagine watering that 5-gallon container thoroughly. The water spreads throughout the entire soil volume, but the seedling's roots can only access moisture in the small zone immediately around them. The remaining 90% of that soil stays wet, undisturbed, dark, and increasingly hospitable to fungal growth, for potentially a week or more before the seedling's expanding roots ever reach it. Now picture the opposite scenario. That same tomato plant, 8 weeks later, now 3 feet tall and heavily flowering, still confined to a 1-gallon pot. Gently tip the pot over and slide the root ball out. Instead of loose, dark potting mix, you'd see almost nothing but a dense, tightly wound spiral of white and tan roots, completely encasing the small remaining core of soil, holding the exact cylindrical shape of the pot even without the plastic container around it anymore. Here is exactly how to get container sizing right, every single time, for nearly any plant you want to grow. First, research the mature size of whatever you're planting before you ever buy your container. Seed packets, nursery tags, and reputable gardening references will tell you the expected mature height and spread. Use this information, not the current seedling size, to guide your container choice. Second, follow general sizing guidelines as a starting reference point. Then, adjust based on your specific variety and climate. As a broad rule of thumb, small herbs like basil, thyme, and chives do well in containers as small as 1 to 3 gallons. Leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, and kale generally want at least 3 to 5 gallons, and do beautifully in wider, shallower containers, since their roots are relatively shallow but appreciate horizontal space. Compact root vegetables like radishes need only modest depth, but carrots need surprisingly deep containers, often 12 inches or more of loose soil depth, to develop long, straight roots without forking or stunting. Bush beans are comfortable in the 3 to 5 gallon range, while pole beans, being more vigorous, appreciate 5 gallons or more, along with sturdy support. Peppers and eggplants generally want a minimum of 5 gallons each, and perform noticeably better in 7 to 10 gallons. Tomatoes are the classic example of a plant that's frequently undersized. Determinate, bush-type tomatoes need a genuine minimum of 10 gallons, and indeterminate, vining tomato varieties truly perform best with 15 to 25 gallons of root space. Potatoes need depth above all else, ideally growing in containers, or grow bags that allow at least 18 to 24 inches of depth, so you can progressively hill soil up around the developing tubers. Cucumbers do well in the 5 to 10 gallon range when given vertical support to climb. Strawberries, being shallow-rooted but spreading, do beautifully in wide, relatively shallow containers, or dedicated strawberry pots with multiple planting pockets. Blueberries, which have fine, fibrous root systems and specific soil requirements we'll touch on more when we discuss soil mixes, generally want a minimum of 10 to 15 gallons for a full-sized bush, or 5 gallons for a genuinely dwarf variety. Dwarf citrus trees and other dwarf fruit trees need substantial containers, usually starting around 15 gallons for younger trees and graduating up to 25 or 30-gallon containers or larger as the tree matures over several years. Third, when starting seedlings, resist the urge to plant tiny starts directly into their final, full-sized container. Instead, use the step-up approach. Start seeds or young transplants in appropriately small containers, then move them into progressively larger pots as the root system fills each stage. This keeps the ratio of root activity to soil volume in a healthy range at every point in the plant's development, avoiding both the too small, root-bound problem and the too large, prolonged dampness problem simultaneously. Fourth, learn to recognize when it's genuinely time to size up. Gently tip the plant out of its current container periodically, especially if you notice increased watering frequency or roots visible at the drainage holes. If you see roots beginning to circle the outer edge of the root ball, but there's still some visible soil, that's your ideal window to move up one container size. If the roots have completely taken over with barely any soil visible, you've likely waited a bit longer than ideal, but it's not too late to correct course. Experienced growers often use a technique called potting up, rather than jumping straight to a final large container. This means increasing container size incrementally, moving from a 1-gallon to a 3-gallon, then to a 7-gallon, then to the final mature size, rather than one dramatic jump. This measured approach keeps root-to-soil ratios consistently healthy throughout the plant's development. Another professional technique, particularly useful for gardeners working with limited space, is selecting genuinely dwarf or compact cultivars specifically bred for container performance. Plant breeders have developed dwarf tomato varieties, patio pepper varieties, and compact bush cucumber varieties specifically because they reach a smaller mature size, while still producing respectable yields, making proper container sizing far more manageable in tight spaces like balconies and small patios. Prevention here really comes down to planning before planting, not reacting after problems appear. Before you bring home a seedling or start seeds, know what that plant's mature size will be, and select or plan for a container that matches. Build the step-up schedule into your seasonal planning from day one, rather than treating repotting as an emergency response to a struggling plant. Ongoing maintenance means periodically checking root development, particularly for fast-growing plants like tomatoes and cucumbers during their peak growing months, and being willing to size up proactively rather than waiting for visible distress signals. In hot, dry climates, think inland Australia, the American Southwest, or a particularly hot, exposed UK summer, undersized containers become problematic even faster, because higher evaporation rates mean the limited soil volume dries out even more rapidly. Gardeners in these climates should generally size up from the standard recommendations I gave you, erring toward the larger end of the range. In cooler, wetter climates, the oversized container risk of prolonged dampness and root rot becomes proportionally more significant, since evaporation is slower and rainfall or humidity keeps soil moist for longer naturally. Gardeners in the UK, coastal New Zealand, and the Pacific Northwest of North America should be particularly mindful not to oversize containers for young seedlings. Indoors, weight and footprint become the limiting practical factors more than horticultural ones. A 25-gallon citrus container simply may not be feasible on a windowsill, which is exactly why selecting dwarf varieties suited to the realistic container size you can accommodate indoors matters so much. On balconies, structural weight limits are a genuine, serious consideration. Always check with a building manager or structural guidelines before placing multiple large, soil and water-filled containers on a balcony, since the combined weight can be substantial. On patios and rooftops, exposure to intense, reflected heat from surrounding hard surfaces means containers dry out faster than the same plant would in an in-ground garden bed, reinforcing the importance of not undersizing containers in these particularly harsh, heat-amplified environments. Frequently asked questions. Can I just use a smaller container and water more often to compensate? As we discussed in detail, no. Increased watering frequency cannot fully substitute for adequate root volume, and it often creates its own additional stress cycle of drought and waterlogging. How do I know if my container is truly too small? The clearest test is what we call the tip test. Gently remove the plant from its container periodically and look at the root-to-soil ratio directly, rather than guessing. Is it ever too late to move a plant to a larger container? Almost never, as long as you handle the transition carefully, minimizing root disturbance and choosing a time of day and weather conditions, ideally a cool, overcast day or evening that reduce transplant stress. Experienced growers often keep a simple seasonal calendar noting when each plant was potted up, allowing them to anticipate the next sizing transition proactively rather than reactively. Many also deliberately slightly undersize the very first container for seeds or tiny seedlings, understanding that a slightly snugger fit early on actually encourages a more fibrous, well-branched root system, which then transplants and establishes more successfully in the next size up. The most common correction mistake is overcorrecting dramatically, moving a severely root-bound plant directly into a container many times larger than appropriate, all at once, which can shock the plant and reintroduce the prolonged dampness risk we discussed. The better approach is always a measured, incremental step up. Another common mistake is failing to loosen or gently tease apart circling roots when transplanting a root-bound plant into a larger container. Simply placing the same tight root spiral into more soil without addressing the circling pattern often means those roots continue circling indefinitely rather than branching outward into the new soil volume as they should. Many gardeners don't realize just how much this single decision, the size of the container, cascades into nearly every other aspect of a plant's health. But that's only the beginning, because even with the perfectly sized container, a plant can still be quietly suffocating and drowning from within. Which brings us to our next mistake. Mistake 14. Using containers without drainage. Holes. Using a container without drainage holes, or with drainage holes that are inadequate, blocked, or poorly designed, means water applied to the potting mix has no way to exit the bottom of the container. Instead of passing through the root zone and draining away, excess water accumulates and pools at the base of the pot, sitting in direct, prolonged contact with the plant's root system. This mistake happens constantly, and almost always for aesthetic reasons. Many of the most beautiful decorative pots available, glazed ceramic planters, stylish concrete vessels, elegant metal containers, are manufactured without drainage holes at all, because they're often designed primarily as decorative objects rather than functional horticultural containers. A gardener falls in love with the look of a particular pot, brings it home, plants directly into it, and has no idea they've just created a serious problem because the pot looks entirely normal from the outside. There's another common variation of this mistake. Gardeners who buy a container with drainage holes but then place it inside a decorative outer pot, or cache pot, without drainage, and forget to check whether water is accumulating, unseen, in that hidden outer layer. Gardeners who've been growing in containers for years treat drainage as completely non-negotiable, full stop, before any other consideration about a container. Its color, its material, its style even enters the conversation. They understand that no amount of careful watering, no perfect fertilizer schedule, no ideal sun exposure can compensate for a root system sitting in stagnant water. It is one of the fastest, most reliable ways to kill an otherwise perfectly healthy plant. I mentioned earlier that roots need oxygen, and this is the single most important concept to understand about why drainage matters so profoundly. Roots respire continuously, taking in oxygen from air pockets in the soil and releasing carbon dioxide, essentially breathing in a very real physiological sense. When a container has no way for excess water to drain, water fills every available air pocket in the potting mix from the bottom upward. This displaces the oxygen the roots depend on, and within a surprisingly short window, often just 24 to 48 hours in warm conditions, the roots begin to suffocate. Waterlogged soil structure changes dramatically compared to properly drained soil. The particles that once held distinct air pockets between them become saturated and compressed under the weight of standing water, and the soil essentially transitions from a light, aerated structure into a dense, waterlogged, oxygen-poor mass, particularly at the bottom of the container, where water pools most. This is really the heart of the entire mistake. Proper drainage isn't just about preventing too much water in some vague sense. It's specifically about ensuring that after each watering, gravity pulls excess water down and completely out of the container, which simultaneously pulls fresh air back into the pore spaces the water briefly occupied. This cycle, wet, then drain, then re-aerate, is what keeps a healthy balance of both moisture and oxygen available to roots. Without a drainage hole, that essential cycle simply cannot complete. Water goes in and has nowhere to go except to sit. In a well-drained container, water movement is a one-way, top-to-bottom and out journey. In a container without drainage, water movement essentially stops at the bottom of the pot, creating what's often called a perched water table, a permanently saturated zone that never fully drains, sitting directly beneath and often within the active root zone. Here's a piece many gardeners don't expect. Waterlogged, oxygen-deprived soil actually disrupts nutrient availability significantly, even though you'd think more water would simply mean more dissolved nutrients available. The truth is more complicated. Certain nutrients, particularly nitrogen, become less available to plant roots under low oxygen, waterlogged conditions, because the beneficial soil microorganisms responsible for converting nutrients into plant-available forms are themselves oxygen-dependent and become suppressed or die off in saturated conditions. Speaking of which, the beneficial bacterial and fungal populations we discussed earlier are almost entirely aerobic, meaning they require oxygen to survive and function. Waterlogged, anaerobic conditions don't just fail to support these beneficial populations. They actively favor an entirely different, harmful set of organisms instead, including the specific fungal pathogens responsible for root rot, which thrive precisely in low-oxygen, saturated environments. The earliest sign of drainage trouble is often deceptively similar to the sign of an underwatered plant, which is exactly what makes this mistake so treacherous. Wilting foliage. A stressed, oxygen-starved root system loses its ability to take up water efficiently, even though there's technically plenty of water present in the pot, so the plant wilts as if thirsty. Many gardeners see wilting, assume the plant needs more water, add even more water to a container that's already saturated, and unknowingly accelerate the very problem causing the wilting in the first place. Another early sign is a persistent, musty, slightly sour or swampy smell coming from the soil surface, quite different from the clean, earthy smell of healthy, well-drained potting mix. As the problem progresses, you'll typically see yellowing leaves, starting from the lower, older leaves and progressing upward, often with a somewhat uniform, dull yellow, rather than the more typical patterned yellowing associated with nutrient deficiencies. Stems may become soft or mushy near the soil line. If you gently dig down into the potting mix, it will feel cold, dense, and saturated, rather than lightly moist and crumbly, and it may have a distinctly unpleasant, rotten odor. In advanced cases, gently removing the plant reveals roots that are brown, black, or gray and mushy to the touch, rather than the firm, white, or tan, healthy roots you'd want to see. A hallmark, unmistakable sign of root rot. Left uncorrected, root rot caused by lack of drainage is often fatal, and it progresses faster than most other container gardening mistakes we'll discuss. Once a significant portion of the root system has rotted, the plant loses its ability to take up water and nutrients regardless of what's added to the soil, and the above-ground portion of the plant will decline rapidly, often within just a week or two of the first visible above-ground symptoms, even though the underlying problem had likely been developing for some time before symptoms appeared. Myth number 1. As long as I water carefully and don't overdo it, a pot without drainage holes will be fine. This significantly underestimates how quickly excess water accumulates, especially after rainfall on outdoor containers, when the gardener has no control over how much water the plant receives. Myth number 2. A layer of gravel or rocks at the bottom of a drainage-free pot will solve the problem. This is one of the most widely repeated pieces of gardening advice, and it's genuinely incorrect based on how water actually moves through layered materials. Water doesn't drain into the gravel layer and disappear. It still has nowhere to go, and due to a physical principle relating to how water moves between materials of different particle sizes, the water actually tends to remain in the finer potting mix layer above the gravel longer than you'd expect, effectively raising the saturated zone rather than solving it. The gravel layer creates the illusion of drainage without providing genuine drainage. Myth number 3. Succulents and cacti are the exception. They can handle pots without drainage because they like it dry. This is backwards. Succulents and cacti are actually more vulnerable to root rot from poor drainage than many other plants, precisely because they're adapted to infrequent watering and quick-draining conditions in their native environments, making them especially intolerant of prolonged wet conditions. Picture 2 identical pots side by side, each holding the same variety of plant, each filled with the same potting mix, each given exactly the same amount of water at exactly the same time. One pot has a properly sized drainage hole, the other has none. Watch the water disappear from the first pot within a few minutes, emerging as a small trickle from the drainage hole at the bottom, leaving the mix evenly moist throughout. Now look at the second pot. There's no trickle, no visible change from the outside. But if you could see inside that container, you'd find water pooling at the very bottom, rising slowly with each subsequent watering, invisible from the outside, silently drowning the lower portion of the root system, while the gardener, seeing no obvious problem, continues watering on a completely normal schedule. The most reliable solution is refreshingly simple. Only plant directly into containers that have functional drainage holes. If you fall in love with a beautiful decorative pot that lacks them, you have 2 excellent options. First, if the material allows it, certain ceramics, plastics, and some concrete, you can carefully drill drainage holes yourself using an appropriate masonry or ceramic drill bit, working slowly and keeping the material cool and slightly damp to avoid cracking. Second, and often the safer, more flexible choice, use that beautiful decorative pot purely as a cache pot, an outer decorative sleeve, and keep the plant in its original, properly draining nursery or grow pot nested inside it. This gives you the visual appeal of the decorative container while maintaining genuine functional drainage. If you use the cache pot method, it's essential to check periodically for water accumulating in the bottom of that hidden outer pot after watering or rainfall, and pour it out promptly rather than letting the inner pot sit in accumulated runoff. Experienced growers often add a layer of coarse material specifically designed to protect the drainage hole itself from becoming blocked by compacted soil or root growth over time. A small piece of window screen, a coffee filter, or a shard of broken terracotta placed loosely over the drainage hole allows water to pass freely while preventing the hole from clogging, without creating the false gravel layer barrier we discussed as a myth. For truly large, heavy containers that are difficult to tip and check, some professional growers use a simple wooden or moisture meter probe inserted near the base of the container to check for excess saturation without having to move or tip the pot. Prevention here is straightforward. Make drainage hole verification the very first thing you check before ever planting into any new container, before you even consider its size or the soil you'll use. As ongoing maintenance, periodically check that drainage holes remain clear and unobstructed, particularly in containers that have been in place for a full growing season or more, since roots can sometimes grow into and partially block drainage holes from the inside over time. In regions with heavy seasonal rainfall, think a UK autumn, a New Zealand winter, or the American Southeast during hurricane season, drainage becomes even more critical, since outdoor containers can receive far more water from rainfall in a single day than a gardener would ever intentionally apply by hand, making adequate, unobstructed drainage the difference between a plant surviving a storm system and one that doesn't. In hot, dry climates, drainage remains just as essential, but gardeners in these regions sometimes mistakenly believe drainage matters less because it's so dry here anyway. But a single heavy watering into a poorly drained container can still create the exact same waterlogged, low-oxygen conditions, regardless of the surrounding climate's overall dryness. Indoors, drainage creates an additional practical consideration, managing where that draining water actually goes, since you're likely draining directly onto flooring, furniture, or windowsills rather than the ground. This is exactly what saucers and drainage trays are for, and we'll touch on proper saucer management as part of the solution here. The key principle being that the plant should never be left sitting in accumulated runoff water collected in that saucer. On balconies and patios, well-draining containers mean runoff water will exit onto the balcony floor or patio surface, so positioning matters. Ensure runoff won't create problems for a downstairs neighbor's balcony or damage sensitive flooring, using saucers or trays as needed to manage this responsibly. On rooftops, drainage becomes particularly important structurally as well as horticulturally, since waterlogged containers become significantly heavier, and proper drainage helps prevent unnecessary added weight loads on rooftop growing structures. How many drainage holes does a container actually need? As a general guideline, larger containers benefit from multiple drainage holes rather than just one, since a single hole in a large diameter pot may not be sufficient to drain the full width of saturated soil quickly enough. Many experienced growers add additional holes to large containers that only came with one. Is it possible to have too much drainage? In practical terms, no. Properly sized drainage holes, covered appropriately, won't cause a plant to dry out excessively on their own. Watering frequency and potting mix, which we'll discuss next, have far more influence on moisture retention than drainage hole quantity. What about self-watering containers with reservoirs? Don't those lack drainage by design? Quality, self-watering containers are specifically engineered with a barrier, typically a wicking system, that separates the water reservoir from the root zone itself, allowing controlled moisture uptake without the roots sitting directly in standing water. This is a fundamentally different, deliberately engineered system, distinct from simply using a decorative pot with no drainage at all. Many experienced container gardeners deliberately elevate their containers slightly off the ground or off patio surfaces using pot feet or small blocks, ensuring the drainage hole itself never becomes blocked by direct contact with a flat surface, which can happen more often than you'd expect, especially on smooth patio tiles or saucers. The most common correction mistake, as we already covered, is relying on a gravel layer at the bottom of a drainage-free pot as a supposed fix. Please don't do this, since it creates a false sense of security, while the underlying problem, a perched water table with nowhere to escape, remains essentially unchanged. Another common correction mistake is drilling drainage holes, but making them too small or too few for the container's size, which provides only marginal improvement over no drainage at all in a large container. The surprising part is that even once a gardener gets drainage completely right, a properly holed container, water moving through cleanly, roots breathing exactly as they should, there's still one more foundational piece that can undo all of that good work from the inside. And it's a mistake almost every beginner makes at least once, usually without ever realizing it happened. Mistake 13. Using garden soil instead of potting mix. This mistake means digging soil directly from your yard, garden bed, or a bag of generic topsoil, and using it to fill a container, rather than using a proper potting mix specifically formulated for container growing. On the surface, this seems like it should be completely fine. After all, it's soil, and plants grow in soil, don't they? But garden soil and potting mix are fundamentally, structurally different materials, engineered for entirely different environments, and using one in place of the other creates serious, compounding problems. This is, understandably, one of the most common mistakes among beginner container gardeners, and I genuinely don't blame anyone for making it, because the logic seems perfectly sound at first glance. You have soil right there in your yard, free and abundant. You've perhaps grown a beautiful in-ground vegetable garden for years, using nothing but that same native soil, amended with compost. So when you decide to try a few containers on the patio, reaching for a shovel and digging into that same trusted, familiar soil feels like the natural, sensible, budget-conscious choice. Why would you spend money on bagged potting mix when there's perfectly good soil right outside? Some gardeners also make a related version of this mistake by purchasing cheap, generic topsoil from a garden center, assuming that because it's sold at a garden center in a bag, it must be appropriate for container use, without realizing topsoil and potting mix are formulated for entirely different purposes. Gardeners with container growing experience have almost universally learned, often through a season of stunted, poorly performing, or outright dead container plants, that garden soil behaves completely differently once it's confined inside a pot compared to how it behaves spread out across an open garden bed. They understand that the physical structure requirements for soil in a container are fundamentally different from soil in the ground, and they treat proper potting mix as a non-negotiable investment, not an optional upgrade. Garden soil, particularly soil with a meaningful clay or silt content, is structured to remain stable and cohesive under the weight of the earth pressing down around and above it in an open bed, with a vast network of existing channels created by earthworms, decomposing root systems, and years of natural freeze-thaw cycles, all of which create passageways for new roots to follow. None of that existing structure exists inside a container. Garden soil placed into a pot has no surrounding pressure to hold its structure open, and over time, often surprisingly quickly, sometimes within just a few waterings, it settles and compacts into a dense, heavy mass, dramatically restricting the space available for new root growth to penetrate. This is really the crux of the entire issue. Quality potting mix is deliberately engineered to remain light, loose, and well aerated specifically within the confined, compressed environment of a container. It typically combines materials like sphagnum peat moss or coconut coir for moisture retention, perlite or vermiculite for aeration and drainage, and sometimes composted bark or other organic matter, all combined in ratios specifically designed to resist compaction over time even when confined to a pot. Garden soil contains none of this deliberate engineering. It's composed of mineral particles, sand, silt, and clay in varying proportions, along with organic matter, that are structured to function within the context of the broader earth around them, not within the confines of a plastic or ceramic container. Because garden soil compacts so readily in a container, its drainage and aeration properties deteriorate rapidly after transplanting. What may have drained perfectly well, spread across an open garden bed, becomes dense, and slow draining, once confined, essentially recreating many of the same low-oxygen, waterlogged conditions we discussed in the drainage mistake. Except this time, the problem originates from the soil's own internal structure, rather than from a missing drainage hole. Garden soil in a container often develops uneven water movement patterns. Clay-heavy garden soil, in particular, can develop a phenomenon where water sits on the compacted surface and struggles to penetrate downward at all. Then, once it finally does penetrate, drains far too slowly, creating alternating periods of surface dryness and deep waterlogging within the very same container. Garden soil's nutrient profile is also generally unpredictable for container use, since it reflects whatever was happening in that particular patch of your yard: years of grass clippings, prior fertilizer applications, possibly herbicide residue, or nutrient depletion from previous plantings. Potting mix, by contrast, typically starts as a nutritionally more controlled, consistent base, often with a modest starter charge of balanced nutrients, giving you a predictable foundation to build your fertilizing program on top of. This point deserves particular attention because it cuts in a somewhat unexpected direction. Garden soil naturally contains a far more diverse population of soil organisms than sterile, bagged potting mix, which sounds like an advantage, and in the open ground, it absolutely is. But that same diverse population includes organisms that can become problematic within the confined, compacted, often overly wet conditions a container creates, including certain fungal pathogens, weed seeds, and sometimes insect larvae or eggs, all of which get concentrated directly into the small, enclosed environment of your pot, without the natural checks and balances of a larger, more diverse ecosystem to keep them in balance. The earliest sign that garden soil is causing trouble in a container is usually a change in how water behaves after watering, either sitting on top and taking a noticeably long time to soak in, or draining through very quickly with the container feeling unexpectedly heavy and dense to lift compared to how a properly filled container should feel. As the problem develops, you'll typically notice stunted growth compared to identical plants grown in proper potting mix, along with the compacted soil surface, sometimes visibly cracking as it dries, similar to how open ground cracks during a drought, which is a telling visual sign that you're dealing with soil structured for open ground conditions. Weeds may also sprout unexpectedly from weed seeds that were present in the original garden soil. Over a full growing season, plants grown in straight garden soil inside containers typically show meaningfully reduced vigor, smaller yields, and increased susceptibility to root-related diseases compared to genetically identical plants grown in proper potting mix, due to the cumulative effects of compaction, poor aeration, and inconsistent water and nutrient availability we've just walked through in detail. Myth number 1. Soil is soil. It grows plants fine in my garden, so it'll grow plants fine in a pot too. As we've just covered in real depth, the confined environment of a container changes soil behavior so fundamentally that this assumption simply doesn't hold up. Myth number 2. I can just add sand to garden soil to improve drainage for containers. This is a particularly persistent and problematic myth. Adding sand to clay-heavy garden soil, rather than improving structure, can actually make things significantly worse, creating a texture with a consistency similar to concrete once it dries, because the small clay particles fill in the gaps between the larger sand particles rather than creating the open, airy structure you're hoping for. Myth number 3. Topsoil and potting mix are basically the same product. Topsoil is generally intended as a base layer or amendment for in-ground garden beds and typically contains a meaningful proportion of mineral soil, whereas true potting mix is specifically engineered as a lightweight, well-aerated, soilless, or mostly soilless growing medium. Take a handful of garden soil straight from a typical yard and a handful of quality potting mix, and simply feel the difference between them. The garden soil, especially if there's any clay content, feels dense and can be compressed into a ball that holds its shape when squeezed. The potting mix feels noticeably lighter, looser, almost fluffy, full of visible texture from bark pieces, and when compressed, it springs back apart rather than holding a compacted shape. Now imagine filling two identical containers, one with each material, watering both identically, and setting them side by side for a season. The potting mix container stays light and well aerated week after week, while the garden soil container gradually becomes denser and heavier with each watering cycle, exactly as we've described. The most straightforward solution is simply committing to using quality, bagged potting mix specifically labeled for container or potting use, rather than garden soil or generic topsoil for any container gardening project. Look for potting mixes that list ingredients like peat moss or coconut coir, perlite, and compost or aged bark, rather than products simply labeled soil or topsoil without further description. For gardeners who want to reduce cost or environmental impact of buying large amounts of bagged mix, a good middle path is creating your own container-appropriate mix by combining a smaller proportion of high-quality, finished compost or screened garden soil with a larger proportion of materials specifically chosen for aeration and drainage, such as perlite, coarse sand in the right proportion, and coconut coir, deliberately building a container-appropriate structure rather than using raw garden soil straight from the ground. For specific plants with specialized soil needs, like blueberries, which require distinctly acidic soil conditions, seek out or create specialty mixes formulated specifically for that plant type, since a standard all-purpose potting mix won't provide the particular pH conditions blueberries need to take up nutrients properly. Many experienced growers create their own custom potting mix recipes tailored to specific plant categories, adjusting the ratio of moisture-retaining components to aerating components based on whether they're growing thirsty, moisture-loving plants or more drought-tolerant, quick-draining specialists like succulents or Mediterranean herbs. Professional growers also often reserve a portion of previous season's used potting mix, refresh it by mixing in fresh compost and a portion of new perlite to restore aeration and nutrients, and reuse it for less demanding plants, rather than either purchasing entirely new mix every season or falling back on garden soil to save money. Prevention simply means building the cost and sourcing of proper potting mix into your container gardening planning from the outset, treating it as an essential material rather than an optional upgrade. As ongoing maintenance, potting mix does break down and compact somewhat over time, even the good stuff. So many experienced growers refresh or partially replace the top few inches of mix in long-term perennial containers annually, and fully refresh mix in annual vegetable containers each new growing season. In consistently hot climates, potting mixes with higher moisture-retaining components, like a greater proportion of coconut coir, help containers hold on to moisture longer between waterings during intense heat. In consistently damp, cooler climates, mixes with a higher proportion of aerating, quick-draining components, like perlite, help prevent the compounding moisture problems that combine so easily with naturally higher ambient humidity and rainfall. Indoors, using a clean, quality, bagged potting mix rather than garden soil is particularly important for an additional reason beyond structure. Garden soil can introduce pests, weed seeds, and soil-borne pathogens into an indoor environment far more easily than a properly processed, bagged potting mix, which is typically far cleaner in this respect. On balconies, patios, and rooftops, weight is again a relevant practical factor. Quality potting mix is generally significantly lighter than garden soil of the same volume, particularly once garden soil becomes saturated with water, making proper potting mix the more practical choice for weight-sensitive, elevated growing spaces, as well as for horticultural reasons. Frequently asked questions. Can I ever use garden soil in a container at all? Used sparingly, as a smaller supplementary component within a larger, deliberately engineered mix, alongside adequate aeration materials. Finished garden soil or compost can contribute beneficial organic matter and microbial diversity, but it should never be used as the primary or sole growing medium in a container. Why is potting mix so much more expensive than just digging up soil? The cost reflects the sourcing, processing, and blending of specific materials. Quality peat or coir, perlite, aged bark, and often a starter nutrient charge, engineered specifically to perform well within the demanding, confined conditions of container growing, which garden soil was never designed to do. Does potting mix run out of nutrients over time? Yes, generally within a matter of weeks to a couple of months, depending on the mix and how heavily the container is planted, which is exactly why an ongoing fertilizing program, something we'll explore in much greater depth later in this documentary, is essential for container-grown plants, regardless of how good the initial potting mix was. Some experienced growers test the pH and general composition of any garden soil or compost they intend to incorporate into a custom mix before adding it, using a simple home soil test kit, ensuring they understand what they're introducing into their carefully balanced container recipe rather than adding an unknown quantity. A common correction mistake is switching to proper potting mix but then continuing to water on the same schedule that worked for garden soil, without adjusting to potting mix's generally faster drainage and quicker drying time, particularly near the surface. This can lead to underwatering stress in a plant that's otherwise now growing in an excellent, well-structured medium. Another correction mistake is over-amending a good quality potting mix with additional garden soil just to add a little extra nutrition, inadvertently reintroducing the very compaction problems the switch to potting mix was meant to solve in the first place. Now that we've seen how the wrong soil can quietly undermine even the healthiest-looking container plants, it's time to look at another mistake that affects almost every container gardener at some point. At first glance, it seems like a sign of good care, but in reality, it often causes more damage than people realize. Mistake 12. Overwatering container plants. If there's one mistake that quietly destroys more container gardens than any other, it's this one. And the tragedy is that most gardeners who make it believe they're doing everything right. Overwatering feels like love. You see a plant looking a little tired in the afternoon heat, and the instinct is to reach for the hose. Water feels generous. Water feels like care. But in a container, water behaves completely differently than it does in open ground, and that difference is where so many patios, balconies, and rooftop gardens quietly go wrong. In the earth, excess water has somewhere to go. It drains sideways, sinks deeper, gets pulled away by surrounding soil that's often drier than the root zone. A container has none of that freedom. It's a closed system with a flaw. Once the pot is saturated, extra water has only one way out, through the drainage holes, and only as fast as gravity and the potting mix will allow. Here's what most gardeners don't realize. It's rarely the water itself that kills the plant. It's the absence of oxygen that the water leaves behind. Roots don't just drink, they breathe. Root cells respire constantly, pulling oxygen from air pockets in the soil to fuel the energy processes that let them absorb nutrients and grow. When a container is overwatered, those air pockets fill with water instead of air. The roots suffocate, Within 24 to 48 hours of saturated soil, sensitive roots on plants like tomatoes and peppers begin to die back, starting with the finest, most delicate root hairs, the very structures responsible for most water and nutrient uptake in the first place. This is why overwatering often produces symptoms that look exactly like underwatering: drooping leaves, yellowing, a general wilted appearance, and it's the single most common misdiagnosis in container gardening. A gardener sees a droopy tomato plant, assumes thirst, adds more water, and accelerates the very problem they're trying to solve. The science goes deeper. Waterlogged soil doesn't just starve roots of oxygen, it changes the entire microbial environment around them. Healthy potting mix hosts aerobic microorganisms, the beneficial bacteria and fungi that break down organic matter and make nutrients available to roots. When oxygen disappears, anaerobic organisms take over instead, and some of these produce byproducts that are directly toxic to root tissue. This is often the real trigger behind root rot, not simply too much water in the abstract, but a shift in the soil's living ecosystem from beneficial to harmful. Root rot itself develops in stages, and recognizing early signs saves plants that later stages cannot. In the beginning, roots may look slightly gray or translucent, rather than the firm white or tan of a healthy root system. As the condition progresses, roots turn brown, then black, and develop a slimy, mushy texture that comes apart at the slightest tug. By the time the above-ground plant shows dramatic wilting despite wet soil, a significant portion of the root system is often already compromised, sometimes beyond recovery. A common myth is that root rot is caused by bad soil or bad luck. In truth, it's almost always a drainage and watering frequency problem. Containers without adequate drainage holes, sources that trap standing water beneath the pot, or a potting mix that's too dense and fine, these are the real culprits, and every one of them is preventable. Let's talk about what experienced growers do differently. First, they check before they water, not on a schedule, but by testing the soil itself. The classic finger test, inserting a finger 2 inches into the mix, remains reliable, but professionals often go further, using the weight of the container as an indicator. A well-watered pot is noticeably heavier than a dry one. Lifting it, or tilting smaller containers, becomes a quick, tool-free gauge of moisture that many gardeners overlook entirely. Second, they prioritize potting mix structure over frequency of watering. A quality container mix includes coarse materials, perlite, pine bark fines, coarse sand, that physically hold open air channels even when the mix is moist. Garden soil or cheap topsoil, packed into a pot, compacts into a dense mass with almost no air pockets at all, which is why using straight garden soil in containers is one of the fastest routes to chronic overwatering symptoms, regardless of how carefully you water. Third, they match container size to plant size. An oversized pot, holding a small root system, is a classic overwatering trap. The surrounding soil that isn't yet colonized by roots retains moisture far longer than the plant can use it, staying wet and low oxygen for days after watering. A 6-inch tomato seedling in a 20-gallon container is, ironically, at higher risk of root rot than the same seedling in an appropriately sized 4-inch pot. Seasonal and climate factors change everything here. A balcony garden in humid, low-light conditions might only need watering every 4 or 5 days, while the same species on a sun-blasted rooftop in a dry climate could need water daily. Indoor container plants, without wind or direct sun to pull moisture from the soil surface, are especially vulnerable. Indoor overwatering is arguably the single most common houseplant killer, precisely because evaporation is so slow indoors that the looks dry on top cue is misleading. Practical Plant-specific notes matter too. Tomatoes and peppers, both prone to root rot in soggy mix, do best allowed to dry slightly between waterings. This also improves fruit flavor by concentrating sugars. Blueberries, by contrast, prefer consistently moist, never soggy conditions, and suffer quickly if allowed to dry completely, so the let it dry out rule isn't universal. It depends on the species. Lettuce, spinach, and other shallow-rooted greens sit in the top few inches of soil, which dries faster than deeper layers, so surface dryness for these crops is a much more reliable watering cue than it would be for a deep-rooted tomato. The most common mistake gardeners make while trying to fix overwatering is overcorrecting into chronic underwatering, swinging from daily watering to none at all out of fear. The better fix is structural. Improve drainage. Elevate pots off saucers or trays so water can actually escape. Switch to a coarser mix and only then return to a measured, moisture-tested watering rhythm. A frequently asked question is whether adding more drainage holes to an existing pot helps after the fact. It does. More holes or wider holes meaningfully speed drainage in an existing container, and it's one of the simplest retrofits available. Another common question is whether a saucer under a pot is inherently bad. It isn't, as long as it's emptied within 30 minutes of watering rather than left to sit, since standing water in a saucer wicks right back up into the root zone through capillary action. The advanced professional technique here is bottom watering combined with a drain and wait discipline. Water thoroughly until it runs from the drainage holes, then don't water again until the moisture test says it's time, never on a fixed calendar. This single habit change resolves more overwatering cases than any product or soil amendment ever could. Many gardeners are surprised to learn that the opposite mistake causes just as much damage, just far more slowly and with far less obvious signs. Mistake 11. Underwatering container plants. Underwatering rarely announces itself the way a flood of root rot does. It creeps in, a slightly smaller harvest here, a few crispy leaf edges there, and because the damage is gradual, it's often mistaken for just how the plant is. The fundamental problem is one of physics rather than neglect. Containers hold a finite, limited volume of soil, which means a finite, limited reservoir of water. In open ground, roots can chase moisture downward and outward across a huge volume of earth. In a pot, once that reservoir is used up, there's nowhere left for the roots to go. This is why container plants dry out dramatically faster than the same species planted in the ground, sometimes twice as fast on a hot day, and even faster in small pots, unglazed terracotta, or anything sitting in direct wind. What's happening physiologically when a plant is underwatered goes well beyond wilting leaves. Water is the medium through which nutrients travel from soil to root to stem to leaf. Without adequate water, that transport system slows or stops even if the nutrients themselves are present in the soil. This is why a chronically underwatered plant often shows nutrient deficiency symptoms: pale leaves, poor fruiting, even when it's been fertilized correctly. The fertilizer is there, it simply can't move. Underwatering also triggers a defensive response called stomatal closure. Stomata are the microscopic pores on leaf undersides that plants use to exchange gases and lose water vapor as part of photosynthesis. Underwater stress, plants close these pores to conserve moisture, which also shuts down photosynthesis, halting growth and fruit development almost entirely during the stress period, even after watering resumes and visible wilting disappears. This is a critical, underappreciated point. The visible recovery after a good soak is faster than the internal, physiological recovery, so plants that are repeatedly underwatered and rewatered accumulate stress and setback even if they never look badly wilted in photographs. Root development itself changes course under chronic underwatering. Instead of the fine, branching, water and nutrient-absorbing root hairs a healthy plant develops, drought-stressed roots often grow longer and more sparse, chasing what little moisture exists deeper in the pot, rather than building the dense network that supports vigorous top growth. Once that pattern sets in early in a plant's life, it can limit productivity for the entire season, even with perfect watering from that point forward. Warning signs to catch early include leaves that feel thin, slightly leathery, or curl inward along their length, a defensive shape change that reduces surface area exposed to sun and air. Advanced symptoms include marginal leaf scorch, browning that starts at the leaf edge and moves inward, blossom drop on fruiting plants like tomatoes and peppers, and in extreme cases, blossom end rot, which is often blamed entirely on calcium deficiency, but is, more precisely, a calcium transport problem, and water is the transport mechanism. Inconsistent watering, wet-dry cycling disrupts calcium uptake even when soil calcium levels are perfectly adequate, which is exactly why blossom end rot shows up so often on tomatoes and peppers grown in containers that dry out completely between infrequent, heavy waterings. A widespread beginner misconception is that succulents and drought-tolerant herbs like rosemary or thyme don't need to be monitored at all. They tolerate drought far better than tomatoes or lettuce, but tolerate isn't thrive. Chronic underwatering still slows growth and reduces yield in herbs grown for harvest, even if the plant survives and looks superficially fine. Deep watering is the core solution, and it's worth understanding exactly why it outperforms frequent shallow sprinkles. A quick daily splash wets only the top inch or two of soil, encouraging roots to stay shallow, close to that reliably moist surface layer, which then makes the plant even more vulnerable to heat and wind, since shallow roots dry out fastest. Deep watering, saturating the container until water runs from the drainage holes, pulls moisture, and the roots chasing it, throughout the entire container depth, building a more resilient, deeper root system that can access a larger water reserve between waterings. Mulching is one of the most underused tools for preventing underwatering in containers. A 1 to 2 inch layer of mulch, straw, shredded bark, or even gravel for ornamentals, dramatically slows surface evaporation. And on a hot patio or rooftop, this alone can extend the interval between waterings by a day or more. It also moderates soil temperature, which matters more than most gardeners realize. Container soil can spike well above ambient air temperature in direct sun, and heat-stressed roots lose function even when moisture is technically adequate. Seasonal adjustment is essential and frequently ignored. The watering schedule that kept a container tomato happy in cool spring weather will starve it by midsummer, when higher temperatures and longer daylight dramatically increase transpiration. Professional growers don't work off a fixed schedule at all. They reassess every few days as temperatures shift, checking soil moisture directly rather than trusting a routine set weeks earlier. Climate and placement differences deserve real attention here. Rooftop gardens face intensified sun, reflected heat from surrounding surfaces, and near constant wind, all of which pull moisture from soil far faster than a shaded, sheltered balcony. Indoor containers sit at the opposite extreme, often needing watering far less frequently, which means gardeners who move plants between indoor and outdoor settings seasonally need to consciously reset their watering habits rather than carrying one location's rhythm to the other. A common mistake made while correcting underwatering is swinging too hard toward frequent, shallow watering out of anxiety, recreating shallow root systems instead of solving the real problem. The fix is depth and thoroughness, not frequency alone. Another frequent question is whether self-watering containers eliminate the risk entirely. They reduce it significantly by maintaining a consistent moisture reservoir, but they aren't foolproof, since a reservoir that runs dry in hot weather can still catch a gardener off guard, particularly on vacation or during a heat wave. For crops like carrots and radishes, underwatering during root formation causes a particularly frustrating and specific problem: woody, split, or oddly shaped roots, since inconsistent moisture during the swelling stage disrupts even growth. Strawberries respond to underwatering with smaller, less juicy fruit, since fruit is largely water by volume, and any deficit shows up directly in yield quality. Before we move to the next mistake, it's worth pausing here, because everything we've covered so far about water is really a foundation for everything that comes next. If this kind of practical, science-backed gardening knowledge is genuinely useful to you, this is a good moment to hit like and subscribe, since it directly helps this channel keep making deep-dive content like this. And if a specific mistake here connects to something in your own garden right now, drop it in the comments. Those comments genuinely shape which topics get covered in future videos. Now, back to the list, because the mistakes ahead affect plants in ways that are even easier to miss. Mistake 10. Forgetting to fertilize. Container plants live under a constraint that ground-planted gardens simply don't face: a strictly limited, non-renewing nutrient supply. In open soil, an entire ecosystem continuously replenishes nutrients. Organic matter decomposes, minerals weather out of rock and clay particles, deep root systems tap layers of soil untouched by the plants above. A container has none of this ongoing renewal. Whatever nutrients exist in the bag of potting mix at planting time are, for the most part, all the plant will ever get, unless a gardener actively adds more. This is where a common and understandable misconception takes root. Many beginners assume that because their potting mix looks rich, dark, and full of nutrients, it will sustain a plant for an entire growing season. In reality, most bagged potting mixes contain only a modest starter charge of fertilizer, if any, and even mixes labeled as nutrient-enriched are typically formulated to last only 4 to 6 weeks before those nutrients are exhausted by an actively growing plant. The scale of nutrient demand from container vegetables is often underestimated. A single container tomato plant, over a full fruiting season, draws heavily on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, plus a range of micronutrients like calcium, magnesium, and iron, in quantities that a small volume of potting mix simply cannot supply on its own. Without supplemental fertilizing, plants don't usually die outright from lack of nutrients. Instead, they stall, producing slow, stunted growth, pale foliage, and a fraction of the fruit they're genetically capable of. Understanding what each major nutrient actually does clarifies why deficiencies show up the way they do. Nitrogen drives leafy, vegetative growth and is a core building block of chlorophyll, so nitrogen-deficient plants typically show overall pale, yellowish leaves, starting with the oldest, lowest leaves first, since the plant relocates whatever nitrogen it has to newer growth. Phosphorus is central to root development, flowering, and fruit set, and phosphorus-deficient plants often show a telltale purplish tinge on leaf undersides, along with delayed flowering. Potassium regulates water movement within the plant and supports fruit quality, and a potassium deficiency frequently shows up as browning or scorching along leaf edges, a symptom easily and commonly confused with the underwatering leaf scorch discussed earlier, which is exactly why diagnosing container plant problems requires looking at the whole picture rather than a single symptom in isolation. Calcium deficiency deserves special attention because of its direct link to blossom end rot in tomatoes and peppers. As covered earlier, this isn't purely a fertilizing issue, it's often a watering consistency issue that prevents calcium from moving through the plant. But true calcium deficiency in the potting mix itself can also be a root cause, which is why experienced growers sometimes amend container mix with crushed eggshell or gypsum at planting time. The difference between fertilizer types matters more than most beginners realize. Slow-release, granular fertilizers, mixed into the potting mix at planting or applied as a top dress, release nutrients gradually, over weeks or months, as they're triggered by moisture and temperature, providing a steady baseline that reduces the risk of both deficiency and the opposite problem, fertilizer burn. Liquid fertilizers act far faster, making them ideal for correcting an active deficiency or giving a boost during heavy fruiting. But they're used up quickly and need reapplication every 1 to 2 weeks during the growing season for consistent results. Organic fertilizers, compost, worm castings, fish emulsion, kelp meal, release nutrients more slowly still, as soil microorganisms break them down, and they carry the added benefit of feeding the beneficial microbial life discussed earlier in relation to root health, making them a favorite among growers focused on long-term soil quality, rather than just this season's harvest. A frequent beginner mistake, made in the opposite direction, is overcompensating once a deficiency is noticed, applying a strong dose of fertilizer all at once in hopes of a quick fix. Because containers have such a limited soil volume, this concentrates salts around the root zone far more intensely than the same dose would in open ground, and can burn roots, showing up as scorched leaf margins that, confusingly, look almost identical to the underwatering and potassium deficiency symptoms described earlier. The safer professional approach is to fertilize at half the labeled strength but with double the frequency, giving the plant a steady, gentle supply rather than feast and famine cycling. Different crops have meaningfully different appetites. Leafy greens, like lettuce, spinach, and kale, are relatively light feeders and can be overfed into excessive, lush growth that's actually more attractive to pests and more prone to bolting in heat. Heavy fruiting crops, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, are the opposite, consistently hungry throughout the season, especially once flowering begins, and benefit from a fertilizer formulated with lower nitrogen and higher phosphorus and potassium at that stage, since excess nitrogen during flowering pushes leafy growth at the expense of fruit. Herbs generally prefer to be underfed rather than overfed, since excessive fertility dilutes the essential oils responsible for flavor and aroma, a rare case in container gardening where more nutrients actually reduce quality rather than improve it. Fruit trees grown in containers, dwarf citrus, dwarf apple or fig varieties, have their own long-term fertilizing rhythm, needing a balanced feed through the growing season plus a specific micronutrient boost, particularly iron and magnesium, since these are easily locked up in container soil, and citrus in particular is notorious for showing yellow leaf veining, a classic iron deficiency symptom called interveinal chlorosis, when grown in pots without supplementation. Seasonal timing changes fertilizing needs considerably. Most annual vegetables need increasing fertility as they move from vegetative growth into flowering and fruiting, then can taper off as the season winds down. Perennial container plants, including dwarf fruit trees, generally need little to no fertilizer during dormancy in cooler months, and fertilizing during dormancy can actually push weak, poorly timed growth that's vulnerable to cold damage, a mistake gardeners in mild climates sometimes make by fertilizing year-round out of habit. A commonly asked question is how to fertilize when a plant already looks stressed from water issues. The answer professionals rely on is to resolve the watering problem first. Fertilizing a plant that's currently underwatered can concentrate salts dangerously, since there isn't enough water present to dilute and distribute the nutrients, while fertilizing an overwatered, oxygen-starved root system adds a burden the roots often aren't functioning well enough to process. The advanced technique many experienced container gardeners rely on is foliar feeding during periods of heavy fruit production, a diluted liquid fertilizer applied directly to leaves, which some nutrients can absorb rapidly through leaf surfaces, giving a fast supplemental boost during the highest demand weeks of the season, without adding to the root zone's existing fertility load. Mistake 9. Overcrowding containers. The ninth mistake is one born almost entirely of enthusiasm, and it's one of the hardest to resist because on the day of planting, an overcrowded container looks wonderful. A pot full of seedlings, evenly spaced, promising a lush and abundant harvest. The trouble is that what looks perfect on planting day becomes a slow-motion competition for survival within a matter of weeks. Every container holds a fixed volume of soil, and that fixed volume represents a fixed total of water, nutrients, and physical root space. Overcrowding takes that already limited resource pool and divides it among more plants than it can properly support. And every one of the previous mistakes we've covered, overwatering, underwatering, nutrient deficiency, becomes both more likely and harder to diagnose once overcrowding enters the picture. The competition starts below the surface, invisibly, long before anything looks wrong above ground. Roots from neighboring plants intertwine and compete directly for the same soil volume, water, and nutrients. In an appropriately spaced container, a tomato's root system can spread and branch freely, crammed against 2 or 3 other root systems. That same plant is forced into a much smaller effective volume, which functionally shrinks the pot from the root's perspective, even though the container itself hasn't changed size at all. Airflow is the second, less obvious casualty. Dense, overcrowded foliage traps humidity around leaves and stems, creating a microclimate that's noticeably more favorable to fungal diseases, powdery mildew, botrytis, early blight, than the same plants would experience with proper spacing and open air movement between them. This is why overcrowded container tomatoes and cucumbers so often develop fungal issues even when watering and fertilizing have been done correctly. The problem isn't in the soil at all, but in the humid microenvironment overcrowded leaves create around themselves. Light competition compounds everything further. Overcrowded plants shade each other, and lower leaves in a crowded container often receive so little light that the plant abandons them, yellowing and dropping them to conserve energy. A natural but wasteful response that reduces the plant's total photosynthetic capacity right when it needs energy most for fruit production. A widespread beginner misconception is that seed packet spacing guidelines are overly cautious and can be safely ignored in containers, since the plants will just grow a bit smaller. In truth, container conditions make proper spacing more important than in open ground, not less, precisely because there's no reserve soil volume nearby for roots to expand into once the initial space is used up. Different crops reveal overcrowding stress in different, characteristic ways, and recognizing these patterns early prevents a full season of disappointing yields. Overcrowded lettuce and spinach bolt, shifting prematurely into flowering and seed production, far earlier than properly spaced plants, since crowding stress signals the plant to reproduce quickly rather than invest in leafy growth. Overcrowded carrots and radishes produce small, twisted or forked roots as they physically deflect around neighboring roots in compacted, contested soil. Overcrowded beans and peas produce noticeably fewer pods per plant, since flower and pod formation is directly tied to the energy reserves a competing, resource-starved plant simply doesn't have available. Overcrowded strawberries, planted too densely in a single container, often produce abundant leaves, but disappointingly few, small berries, since runner and fruit production are both casualties of root competition. Container size and plant count need to be matched deliberately rather than estimated by eye. A single tomato plant generally needs a container in the range of 15 to 25 gallons to reach full productive potential. 2 tomato plants sharing that same container isn't twice the harvest. It's typically a reduced harvest from both plants combined, compared to what one plant alone would have produced in that space. Compact crops like radishes and lettuce tolerate closer spacing far better than large fruiting crops. But even these have real limits. A common overcrowding mistake is treating baby greens spacing, appropriate for a quick, cut-and-come-again harvest, as though it applies to full-head lettuce varieties grown to maturity, which need considerably more room to develop properly. Herbs present a special case worth understanding. Some, like basil, actually benefit from being planted a bit closer together, since mild competition encourages bushier, more compact growth that many cooks prefer. But this benefit disappears quickly past a certain density, at which point the same crowding stress that affects vegetables sets in. Mint, meanwhile, is aggressive enough that it should generally be given its own container entirely, since its rapid, spreading root system will outcompete almost anything sharing space with it. For dwarf fruit trees, overcrowding usually isn't about multiple trees sharing one pot. It's underpotting, keeping a maturing tree in a container that was appropriate for its size 2 or 3 years earlier. Root-bound fruit trees show a specific symptom professional growers watch for: roots visibly circling the inside edge of the pot or emerging from drainage holes, a sign that the container has become the limiting factor on the tree's growth and fruiting, not the tree's own genetics or care. The step-by-step professional solution to existing overcrowding is straightforward, if sometimes emotionally difficult for gardeners attached to every seedling they've raised. Thin ruthlessly and thin early. Removing the weakest 1/3 to 1/2 of seedlings within the first few weeks, well before root systems have deeply intertwined, gives the remaining plants dramatically more resources and almost always produces a larger total harvest than leaving every seedling in place would have. A common mistake gardeners make when finally thinning an overcrowded container is doing it far too late, after root systems are already tangled together, at which point pulling one plant damages the roots of its neighbors. The fix, at that late stage, is to cut the unwanted seedling at soil level with scissors rather than pull it, leaving the remaining roots undisturbed. Prevention, of course, beats correction every time, and it starts with reading spacing guidelines as container-specific minimums, rather than flexible suggestions, sizing containers generously for mature plant size rather than seedling size, and resisting the very natural, very common urge to fill every visible inch of soil on planting day. Balcony and rooftop gardeners, working with limited container space overall, benefit most from choosing fewer, well-spaced plants in appropriately sized pots rather than maximizing plant count per container. Counterintuitively, this approach almost always produces a larger total harvest from the same footprint, not a smaller one. By now, we've covered several of the most common mistakes that quietly reduce the health and productivity of container plants. The next group of mistakes often goes unnoticed because they involve the growing environment itself rather than the plants directly. Understanding these factors can make the difference between plants that simply survive and plants that truly thrive. The wind rustles through container gardens everywhere, and it's about to expose one of the most common, and most fixable, mistakes gardeners make before they even plant a single seed. Mistake 8. Giving sun-loving plants too little sun. Most gardeners assume that any bright spot on a patio or balcony counts as full sun. But the surprising truth is that full sun has a very specific meaning in horticulture. 6 or more hours of direct, unobstructed sunlight every single day. Anything less, and a sun-loving plant begins operating in a state of quiet deficiency that can take weeks to become visible. To understand why this matters, we have to go back to the plant's power source, photosynthesis. Inside every leaf, chloroplasts capture photons of light and use that energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose, the sugar that fuels every part of the plant's life, from root growth to flower formation to fruit ripening. Light isn't just helpful to this process, it's the ignition switch. Without enough of it, the entire chain of energy production slows down, and everything downstream suffers. This is why tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants are such reliable teachers of this mistake. These are heat-loving, sun-hungry plants, native to conditions with intense daylight. A tomato plant, tucked into a container that receives only 3 or 4 hours of morning sun, will often still grow. It'll still produce leaves, it'll still look alive, but it will quietly underperform in the one area gardeners actually care about: fruit. Flower production requires a significant energy surplus, and fruit development requires even more. A plant just scraping by on minimal light puts everything it has into basic survival, leaving little left over for the harvest the gardener is waiting for. There's another factor that's even more important than most beginners realize: the difference between morning sun and afternoon sun. These are not interchangeable. Morning sun is gentler, arriving at a lower angle and lower intensity, gradually warming the plant and the surrounding container. Afternoon sun, especially in the hours between noon and 4, is far more intense, higher in the sky, hotter, and more likely to trigger heat stress if a plant isn't adapted to it. A container that gets 6 hours of afternoon sun is a very different growing environment than one that gets 6 hours of morning sun, even though the hour count looks identical on paper. This is why two gardeners can follow the exact same spacing and watering instructions and get completely different results, simply based on which side of the day their containers are catching light. Signs that a sun-loving plant isn't getting enough light show up gradually, which is part of why this mistake goes undetected for so long. Stems begin to stretch and thin as the plant tries to reach toward available light, a phenomenon called etiolation. Leaves may grow larger and darker green in an attempt to capture more light per leaf, but this comes at the cost of overall sturdiness. Flowering is delayed or sparse, and when flowers do appear, a higher percentage may drop off before setting fruit, because the plant senses it doesn't have the energy reserves to support fruit development through to completion. The long-term consequence, season after season, is a container garden that never quite lives up to its potential, technically alive, technically growing, but never truly thriving. Many beginner gardeners interpret this as a soil problem, or a watering problem, or even blame the variety of seed they chose, when the real issue was decided the moment they picked the container's location. Not every plant suffers equally from this mistake, though, and that distinction matters. Leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, and Swiss chard are far more forgiving of partial sun. In fact, in hot climates, some afternoon shade actually protects these crops from bolting prematurely into flower and turning bitter. Herbs like mint, parsley, and cilantro also tolerate partial sun reasonably well. The mistake isn't insufficient sun in the abstract. It's a mismatch between a specific plant's genetic light requirements and the light its container actually receives. The solution starts with observation, not assumption. Before placing a container permanently, professional growers recommend tracking sunlight across a full day, checking a spot every hour or two from sunrise to sunset, and noting when direct light actually hits that exact location. Phone apps exist for this now, but even a simple notebook and a few days of attention will reveal patterns most people never noticed about their own outdoor space. South-facing spots in the northern hemisphere typically receive the most consistent light throughout the day, while east-facing spots favor gentler morning sun, and west-facing spots deliver more intense afternoon exposure. For gardeners working with a fixed, less-than-ideal location, the solution isn't always to give up on sun-loving plants. It's to work with mobility. Containers, unlike in-ground beds, have the enormous advantage of being able to move. A tomato plant can follow the sun across a patio throughout the season, or be relocated entirely if a testing period reveals its original spot underperforms. Wheeled plant caddies have become a popular tool among container gardeners specifically because they turn this flexibility into an effortless daily habit rather than a wrestling match with a heavy pot. Mistake 7. Growing shade-loving plants in full sun. This next mistake silently reduces harvests in the opposite direction, and it's just as common, because gardeners often assume that more sun is always better. But the surprising truth is that excess light can be just as damaging to the wrong plant as insufficient light is to a sun lover. Shade-tolerant plants, many leafy greens, certain herbs, and some berry varieties, have evolved different internal chemistry than full-sun crops. Their chloroplasts are often optimized to capture and use lower light levels efficiently, which means when they're suddenly exposed to intense, unfiltered sunlight for 6+ hours a day, the very system built to power them starts working against them. The science behind this is called photoinhibition. When a plant absorbs more light energy than its photosynthetic machinery can actually process, the excess energy doesn't just get wasted harmlessly, it can damage the chlorophyll molecules and surrounding cell structures themselves. This is compounded by heat. Intense sun raises leaf surface temperature, and for shade-adapted plants, this often exceeds their comfortable range far faster than it would for a heat-loving crop. Leaf scorch is the most visible sign of this mistake, and it's one every container gardener should learn to recognize early. It appears as pale, bleached, or crispy brown patches, usually concentrated on the parts of the leaf most directly exposed to the sun, often the outer edges or the upper surface. Unlike nutrient deficiencies, which tend to show uniform yellowing, scorch damage is localized and irregular, following the pattern of light exposure rather than the plant's vascular structure. Lettuce and spinach are the textbook examples here. Both are cool-season, shade-tolerant crops that will bolt, shoot up a flowering stalk, and turn bitter when subjected to prolonged heat and intense light, especially as temperatures climb through late spring and summer. A container of lettuce, placed in a spot that seemed like a good, bright location for tomatoes, will often struggle within days once daytime temperatures rise, wilting in early afternoon even when the soil is adequately watered, because the plant is losing water through its leaves faster than its roots can replace it, a condition called transpirational stress. Blueberries offer a more nuanced example, because they're often mistakenly filed into the full sun category due to marketing on plant tags that doesn't account for container-specific stress. In the ground, blueberries can often handle more direct sun because the surrounding soil mass buffers root temperature. In a container, that buffering capacity is dramatically reduced, and root systems can overheat even when the top growth looks fine. A distinction we'll return to shortly, because it connects directly to our next mistake. A common beginner misconception is thinking that shade-loving means a plant wants darkness. In reality, almost every edible plant needs some direct or bright, indirect light to produce meaningful yields. The difference between partial shade and full shade is significant. Partial shade generally means 3 to 6 hours of direct sun, often filtered or occurring during the cooler morning hours. Full shade means less than 3 hours of direct sun, relying mostly on ambient bright light. Very few container vegetables genuinely thrive in full shade. Most so-called shade-tolerant crops are really partial shade plants being asked to tolerate more sun than they'd prefer, not plants that want no sun at all. Seasonal timing changes this equation considerably. A container spot that offers perfect partial shade in July might receive far more direct exposure in early spring or late fall, when the sun sits lower in the sky and shifts its angle relative to nearby structures, fences, or trees. Gardeners in hot climates, the southern United States, the Mediterranean, parts of Australia, often need to actively seek out afternoon shade for crops that guides written for cooler climates describe as full sun plants. A full sun recommendation, written for a cool, cloudy region, can be actively harmful advice in a hot, intensely sunny one. The professional solution to this mistake is strategic shade management rather than simply picking a permanently shadier location. Shade cloth, rated by the percentage of lighted blocks, allows precise control. A 30% shade cloth over a lettuce container during a summer heat spike can keep the crop productive for weeks longer than it would survive unprotected. Positioning containers where they'll receive morning sun but afternoon shade, often the east side of a wall, fence, or larger plant, gives shade-tolerant crops the light they need for photosynthesis, while avoiding the most damaging hours of intensity. Even something as simple as moving containers under the dappled canopy of a larger patio tree during peak summer can be the difference between a productive lettuce bed and a stand of bolted, bitter stalks. Mistake 6. Choosing the wrong container material. Most gardeners assume a container is just a vessel, something to hold soil in place, and give far less thought to what it's made of than they give to what they plant inside it. But the surprising truth is that container material fundamentally changes the growing environment inside, sometimes as dramatically as changing the plant's light exposure altogether. Every container material has a different thermal and moisture profile, and understanding these differences is one of the clearest markers separating casual container gardeners from experienced ones. Terracotta pots are porous and breathable, which allows excess moisture to evaporate through the walls of the pot itself, a real advantage for plants prone to root rot in soggy conditions. But that same porosity means terracotta dries out considerably faster than other materials, requiring more frequent watering, especially in hot or windy conditions. Terracotta also absorbs and radiates heat readily, meaning a terracotta pot sitting in full afternoon sun can reach root-damaging temperatures faster than gardeners expect, since the heat isn't just hitting the soil surface, it's being conducted through the entire container wall. Plastic containers sit at nearly the opposite end of the spectrum. They're non-porous, holding moisture far longer than terracotta, which suits thirstier plants but creates real risk of waterlogging and root rot for plants that prefer drier conditions between waterings, like many herbs. Plastic is also lightweight and relatively insulating compared to unglazed clay, though dark-colored plastic introduces its own serious problem we'll return to in the next mistake. Ceramic pots, particularly glazed ones, behave more like plastic in terms of moisture retention, since the glaze seals the porous clay beneath it, but they carry significantly more mass, which gives them more thermal stability. They heat up and cool down more slowly than thin plastic, buffering root systems against rapid temperature swings. Fabric grow bags have become popular among more experienced container gardeners for a reason rooted directly in root biology. Their breathable walls allow air to reach the root system from all sides, which triggers a process called air pruning. When a root tip reaches the fabric wall and senses air, it stops elongating and instead branches, producing a denser, more efficient root mass rather than the tangled, circling roots that often develop in solid-walled containers. Fabric bags also drain and dry faster than plastic, similar to terracotta, requiring attentive watering, but reducing rot risk substantially. Wooden planters offer excellent insulation, keeping root zones more temperature stable than most other materials. But they require attention to wood treatment and drainage, since untreated wood in constant contact with moist soil will decay over time. Cedar and certain treated woods resist this far better than others. Metal containers are the material most likely to create serious problems for gardeners who choose them primarily for their appearance. Metal conducts heat extremely efficiently, meaning a galvanized steel or aluminum planter in direct sun can see its internal soil temperature climb dramatically faster than any other common material, creating root stress even when the surrounding air temperature seems entirely reasonable. Metal containers used in hot, sunny climates often need an inner plastic liner with an air gap, specifically to interrupt that heat conduction before it reaches plant roots. For crops like carrots and radishes, which develop their harvestable structure underground, container material interacts directly with the crop itself. Inconsistent soil temperature and moisture from a poorly chosen material can cause misshapen, cracked, or stunted roots, since consistent conditions are what allow root vegetables to expand smoothly. The professional approach isn't to declare one material universally best, but to match material to plant needs and climate. In hot climates, gardeners increasingly favor lighter-colored ceramic, thick-walled plastic, or fabric grow bags positioned with some afternoon shade, avoiding metal and dark terracotta entirely for heat-sensitive crops. In cooler, wetter climates, terracotta's fast-drying properties become a genuine asset rather than a liability, helping prevent the fungal and rot issues that excess moisture retention can cause. This is also a natural place to pause and mention something worth doing right now if this video has been useful to you. Hitting like helps this channel reach more container gardeners, and subscribing means you won't miss what's coming. Because the next 4 mistakes are honestly the ones that make the biggest difference between a container garden that limps along and one that genuinely thrives. Turning on notifications means you'll catch new videos the moment they go live. And if you've got a mistake of your own you've learned the hard way, drop it in the comments. Some of the best tips in this series have come directly from viewers sharing what they discovered in their own gardens. Mistake 5. Allowing containers to overheat. What happens next often surprises experienced gardeners as much as beginners, because this mistake can occur even when every other variable, sunlight, watering, soil quality, has been managed correctly. Container overheating is fundamentally a root problem disguised as a foliage problem. Above ground, a heat-stressed plant may show wilting, scorched leaf edges, or slowed growth, symptoms that look identical to underwatering or excess sun exposure. But often, the real damage is happening entirely out of sight, in the root zone, where temperatures inside a container can climb far higher than most gardeners realize. The science here comes down to volume and exposure. An in-ground root system is surrounded by a vast thermal mass of earth that buffers temperature swings. Soil several inches down changes temperature slowly, even on a scorching afternoon. A container, by contrast, is a relatively small, isolated volume of soil with walls directly exposed to sun and air on multiple sides. Research on container soil temperatures has repeatedly shown that on hot, sunny days, soil near the walls of a dark or thin-walled container can exceed 100 degrees Celsius, and in extreme cases, significantly more. Temperatures that begin damaging root tissue and impairing the plant's ability to take up water and nutrients, regardless of how much water is actually available in the soil. This is why container color deserves far more attention than most gardeners give it. Black containers, popular partly because they're inexpensive and widely available as nursery pots, absorb far more solar radiation than light-colored containers. A black plastic pot in full summer sun can reach soil temperatures dramatically higher than an identical white or light-colored pot in the same spot. Sometimes a difference of 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit at the root zone. Reflective or light-colored surfaces bounce a significant portion of solar radiation away rather than absorbing it, keeping the root environment measurably cooler. Heat stress at the root level affects the plant through several connected pathways. Root cell membranes can be damaged directly by excessive heat, impairing their ability to function. Beneficial soil microorganisms that support nutrient cycling and root health decline rapidly above certain soil temperatures. Water uptake efficiency drops even when soil moisture is present, because damaged root tissue simply can't move water as effectively. And because roots are also responsible for producing certain plant hormones that regulate growth and stress response, a compromised root system sends stress signals throughout the entire plant, which is often why the foliage symptoms, wilting, scorch, stunted growth, can appear so suddenly, seemingly overnight, even though the underlying root damage may have been accumulating for days. Water loss compounds this problem. Higher soil temperatures accelerate evaporation from the soil surface, meaning an overheating container also dries out faster, creating a punishing cycle where a plant needs more frequent watering at exactly the moment its damaged roots are least able to make efficient use of that water. Cucumbers, zucchini, and beans are particularly reliable indicators of this mistake because they're fast-growing, thirsty plants that respond quickly and visibly to root stress, often wilting dramatically in early afternoon heat, even in well-watered containers, then partially recovering by evening as temperatures drop and the root zone cools. Gardeners frequently misread this as a watering problem and respond by watering even more, which can worsen the situation by keeping already stressed roots sitting in warm, saturated soil. Citrus and dwarf fruit trees in containers face a particularly serious version of this mistake, because their root systems are more sensitive to sustained heat stress than many annual vegetables, and the consequences compound over a growing season rather than resolving with the next cool evening. Repeated root heat stress in a container citrus tree can suppress flowering and fruit set for the following season, meaning the damage doesn't just cost a few wilted afternoons. It can cost an entire harvest months later. A widespread myth is that simply watering more frequently solves overheating. In reality, while adequate moisture does help buffer soil temperature somewhat, it cannot fully offset the effect of direct solar heating on a small container volume. Prevention has to address the heat source itself, not just the water supply. Mulching the soil surface is one of the most effective and underused solutions available to container gardeners. A 1 to 2 inch layer of mulch, bark, straw, or even a decorative gravel in cooler climates, insulates the soil surface, dramatically reducing both heat absorption and evaporative water loss. Positioning containers so they receive some afternoon shade, even just from a taller neighboring plant or a strategically placed umbrella, interrupts the most intense heat gain hours without sacrificing the morning light many plants need. Grouping containers together, rather than spacing them out individually, allows them to shade each other's walls partially, reducing the total exposed surface area each pot faces. And for gardeners committed to darker or metal containers, for aesthetic reasons, a simple double potting technique, placing the decorative dark container as an outer sleeve around a lighter-colored functional pot with an air gap between them, can meaningfully reduce heat transfer to the actual root zone. At this point, we've uncovered many of the hidden reasons container gardens struggle but the final four mistakes are often the ones that determine whether a gardener enjoys consistent success or repeated disappointment. The next mistake is one that can quietly spread through a container garden before many people even realize there's a problem. And that brings us to the final four mistakes on our list. The ones that, more than any others, separate container gardeners who struggle season after season from those who finally break through into real, consistent success. Mistake 4. Ignoring pest problems until it's too late. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that every container gardener eventually experiences. You walk out one morning, coffee in hand, ready to admire the tomato plant that's finally starting to set fruit, and you notice something is off. A few leaves look slightly curled, a little stippling here, a faint webbing there. It seems minor, barely worth mentioning. So you tell yourself you'll deal with it later, maybe this weekend, maybe after you've watered everything else. That decision, the quiet choice to wait, is mistake 4, and it is one of the most common reasons container gardens collapse seemingly overnight. Why gardeners make this mistake? Part of the problem is psychological. Pests rarely announce themselves. There's no dramatic moment where an aphid colony marches in with fanfare. Instead, populations build exponentially and invisibly, and by the time the damage is obvious to the naked eye, the infestation is already several generations deep. A single aphid can produce dozens of offspring within a week under warm conditions, and those offspring are reproducing before the original aphid has even finished growing. This is called exponential population growth, and it is precisely why "I'll deal with it later" is such a dangerous sentence in a garden. Container plants are especially vulnerable for a structural reason. They exist in a smaller, more concentrated ecosystem than in-ground plants. In a large in-ground vegetable bed, a ladybug or lacewing might patrol dozens of square feet, naturally suppressing early pest populations before a gardener ever notices trouble. A container, by contrast, is often isolated, sitting on a balcony, a patio, or a rooftop, cut off from the surrounding food web of beneficial insects that would otherwise help regulate pest numbers. Without that natural buffer, a small infestation can become a full outbreak far faster than most beginners expect. The science of plant immunity under pest pressure. Every plant has a limited energy budget. That energy is allocated between growth, reproduction, flowers and fruit, and defense. When pest pressure is low, a healthy plant can mount what's called an induced defense response, producing compounds like tannins or alkaloids that make leaves less palatable, or releasing volatile organic compounds that actually attract predatory insects to come hunt the pests attacking it. This is one of the most remarkable things in all of horticulture. A plant under attack can chemically call in reinforcements, but this defense system has limits. If pest pressure remains unchecked and escalates, the plant is forced to divert more and more of its energy budget into defense and away from fruit production, flowering, and root development. This is why a pepper plant, under heavy aphid pressure, will often stop setting new flowers entirely. It isn't being lazy, it's triaging its resources for survival. Early warning signs versus advanced symptoms. Early signs are subtle and easy to miss if you're not looking closely. Tiny stippled or speckled patches on leaf undersides, often spider mites, a faint shine or stickiness on foliage, a sign of aphid honeydew, small irregular holes in leaves, often flea beetles or caterpillars, or slightly curled new growth, frequently aphids or thrips clustering on tender shoots. Advanced symptoms are much harder to reverse. Entire leaves yellowing and dropping, visible webbing between leaves and stems, sooty black mold growing on honeydew residue, stunted or twisted new growth, and in severe cases, wilting that looks like drought stress but doesn't respond to watering because the root system or vascular tissue has been compromised by root-feeding pests like fungus gnat larvae. The real secret: weekly inspection as a habit, not a task. Here's what surprises many beginner gardeners. Professional growers don't have magically pest-free plants. They simply catch problems in days 1 and 2 instead of week 3. The single most powerful tool against pests isn't a spray, it's a habit. Spend 60 seconds per plant, 2 or 3 times a week, turning over a few leaves and looking at new growth. This tiny investment of time is worth more than any pesticide because it lets you intervene while the problem is still small enough to solve by hand. Step-by-step solutions and integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is the professional framework for handling pests without reaching for harsh chemicals as a first response. The steps look like this. First, identify the pest correctly. Treating spider mites with a product meant for caterpillars accomplishes nothing. A cheap handheld magnifying glass is one of the best $5 investments a container gardener can make. Second, start with the least invasive intervention. For soft-bodied pests like aphids and spider mites, a strong, direct spray of water on the undersides of leaves can physically dislodge and control a light infestation. This alone solves a surprising number of early-stage problems. Third, escalate to insecticidal soap or neem oil for moderate infestations, always applied in the early morning or evening to avoid leaf burn in direct sun, and always covering the undersides of leaves where pests congregate. Fourth, introduce or encourage beneficial insects. Ladybugs and lacewing larvae are voracious aphid predators, and many gardeners now buy them specifically for container and greenhouse use. Companion planting with alyssum, dill, and fennel attracts these beneficial insects naturally by providing them with nectar sources. Fifth, for persistent or severe infestations, remove and destroy the most heavily infected material rather than treating the whole plant, especially with soft fruit like strawberries and blueberries, where chemical residue timing matters close to harvest. Companion planting and crop rotation in containers. Companion planting isn't folklore. Much of it has measurable pest management value. Marigolds release compounds that repel certain nematodes and can deter whiteflies. Basil planted near tomatoes is believed to help confuse pest insects that rely on scent to locate their host plants. Nasturtiums act as a trap crop, drawing aphids away from more valuable plants, like peppers and beans. Crop rotation matters in containers too, even though many gardeners assume it's only relevant to large in-ground plots. Soil-borne pests and diseases, like the larvae of certain beetles or fungal spores that overwinter in potting mix, can persist in a container's soil from one season to the next. Rotating what you grow in a given pot, or at minimum, refreshing the top few inches of soil between plantings of the same crop family, breaks this cycle. Climate and setting considerations. Balcony and rooftop gardens tend to see fewer pest problems overall because they're elevated and more exposed to wind, which many soft-bodied pests dislike. Patio gardens closer to the ground and near other vegetation are more vulnerable to pests migrating in from nearby landscaping. Indoor container gardens face a completely different pest profile. Fungus gnats and spider mites thrive in the stiller, often drier air indoors. And without wind or rain to naturally knock back populations, indoor growers need to be even more disciplined about inspection. Frequently asked questions. Should you spray preventatively, even without pests? Generally, no. Unnecessary spraying, even with natural products, can harm the beneficial insects you want to attract and disrupt the balance you're trying to build. Is it normal to lose a plant to pests occasionally? Yes, and experienced gardeners view it as information rather than failure. A repeated pattern often points to a setting issue like overcrowding or poor airflow rather than bad luck. Mistake 3. Neglecting pruning and routine maintenance. This may be the most overlooked mistake of all, because it doesn't feel like a mistake in the moment. It feels like patience. Many gardeners let a plant do its thing, assuming that more leaves and more branches automatically means more harvest. The opposite is often true. Why this happens: pruning feels counterintuitive to beginners because it involves removing living, healthy-looking plant material, something that feels wasteful or even harmful. Nobody wants to cut off a perfectly green leaf. But container plants, growing in a finite volume of soil with finite resources, benefit enormously from having their energy focused rather than spread thin. The science behind pruning every leaf a plant grows requires water and nutrients to maintain, and in return, it produces sugars through photosynthesis. But there's a point of diminishing returns. Once a plant has enough leaf surface area to support its fruit and flower production, additional foliage mostly competes for the same finite water and nutrient supply in a container without meaningfully increasing yield. Worse, dense foliage restricts airflow, which raises humidity around the leaves and creates ideal conditions for fungal diseases like powdery mildew and botrytis. With tomatoes specifically, removing suckers, the small shoots that emerge in the joint between the main stem and a branch, redirects energy toward the fruit clusters that are already forming, rather than toward growing an entirely new, competing stem. Indeterminate tomato varieties in containers benefit enormously from this practice, because containers simply cannot support the sprawling root system needed to feed an unpruned, sprawling plant. Root development and pruning's hidden connection. Here's what surprises many experienced gardeners. Pruning above the soil line also affects what's happening below it. A plant's canopy and root system exist in a dynamic balance. The root system generally grows to support the water and nutrient demands of the leaf canopy above it. An overgrown, unpruned canopy in a restricted container can outstrip what the limited root volume can supply, leading to a plant that wilts readily even when soil moisture is adequate, simply because the roots can't keep pace with the demand from an oversized top growth. Warning signs of neglected maintenance. Early signs include a plant that looks bushy and green, but produces disappointingly few flowers or fruit, yellowing lower leaves that never get removed and begin to harbor fungal spores, and stems that become leggy and weak because they're competing with too many other stems for light. Advanced consequences include collapsed or broken stems under fruit weight because they were never given structural support, widespread fungal infection climbing from the neglected lower leaves upward, and a dramatic drop in fruit quality and size as the plant tries to support far more foliage and fruit sites than its container-limited roots can sustain. Step-by-step pruning and maintenance techniques. Begin routine maintenance early rather than waiting for problems. Check plants weekly for the specific signs relevant to that crop. For tomatoes, remove suckers below the first fruit cluster and any leaves touching the soil. For peppers and eggplants, a light pinch of the top growth point when plants are young encourages a bushier, sturdier structure rather than one tall, unsupported stem. For herbs like basil, regular harvesting from the top, cutting just above a leaf node, is itself a form of pruning that encourages fuller, bushier growth rather than a single tall flowering stalk that turns bitter. Deadheading, removing spent flowers before they go to seed, redirects the plant's energy back into producing new blooms rather than seed production, which is especially valuable for container herbs and flowering companion plants. Seasonal and setting differences. In cooler climates, with shorter growing seasons, later season pruning should focus on removing new flower buds that won't have time to mature into fruit before frost, redirecting the plant's remaining energy into ripening what's already set. In hot climates, Some light shade pruning can actually protect fruit like tomatoes and peppers from sun scald by leaving a bit more strategic leaf cover during the most intense afternoon sun. Balcony and rooftop containers, which see more wind exposure, benefit from maintaining a slightly more compact structure through pruning, both to reduce wind stress on the plant and to prevent top-heavy plants from tipping their containers. Frequently asked questions. Can you over-prune a plant? Yes, removing more than about a third of a plant's foliage at once can shock it and temporarily reduce fruit production, so pruning should be done gradually and routinely rather than as an occasional, aggressive overhaul. Does pruning apply to root vegetables? Less directly, but routine maintenance still matters. Thinning overcrowded carrot or radish seedlings, so each has enough room, is the root vegetable equivalent of pruning, preventing the below-ground competition that produces stunted, misshapen roots. Mistake 2. Planting at the wrong time of year. Here's what surprises many new container gardeners. They assume that because a container can be moved indoors, onto a covered porch, or into a sunnier spot, timing matters less than it does for in-ground gardening. In reality, timing still governs nearly everything about a plant's success: germination rates, root establishment, flowering, pollination, and final harvest quality. Why this mistake happens? Seed packets and plant tags often list a broad range, plant in spring, without accounting for a gardener's specific regional frost dates, day-length patterns, or summer heat intensity. Container gardeners, seeing all that flexibility a pot seems to offer, often plant on an emotional timeline rather than a biological one. The first genuinely warm weekend of the year feels like the right time, regardless of what the plant actually needs. The science of timing germination and early growth are governed heavily by soil temperature, not air temperature. Cool season crops like spinach, lettuce, and radishes germinate best in soil between roughly 45 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and they bolt, sending up a flower stalk prematurely and turning bitter once temperatures climb into summer heat. Warm season crops like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants need soil consistently above about 60 degrees Fahrenheit to germinate reliably, and will simply sit dormant, or worse, rot, in cold, wet soil. Flowering and fruit set are also deeply tied to timing through a process called photoperiodism, where certain plants respond to the changing length of daylight to decide when to shift from vegetative growth into flowering. Planting a long-day flowering herb too late in the season means it may never receive the day-length trigger it needs before autumn shortens the days again. Pollination adds another timing layer entirely. Tomatoes, peppers, and beans generally self-pollinate or are wind-pollinated. But temperature extremes disrupt this. Pollen becomes non-viable above roughly 95 degrees Fahrenheit for many tomato varieties, which is why fruit set often stalls during the hottest weeks of summer, regardless of how healthy the plant looks. Squash and cucumbers, which rely on bee pollination, need their flowering period to coincide with active pollinator populations, which themselves follow seasonal patterns. Early warning signs of poor timing. A cool season crop planted too late shows early bolting. A sudden vertical flower stalk appearing on lettuce or spinach well before the plant has reached a useful harvest size. A warm season crop planted too early shows stunted, purple-tinged leaves from cold stress, or simply fails to germinate at all, with seeds rotting in cold, damp soil. Long-term consequences. Beyond a single failed planting, poor timing compounds across a season. A tomato planted weeks too late may not set its first fruit until the hottest part of summer arrives, and heat stalls pollination, pushing the harvest dangerously close to autumn's first frost, and resulting in a container full of green, unripened fruit at season's end. Solutions and professional techniques. The most reliable fix is knowing your specific region's average last frost date in spring and first frost date in fall, then working backward from seed packet information about days to maturity. Container gardening actually offers a real timing advantage here that's worth using deliberately. Containers can be started indoors, under grow lights, weeks before outdoor conditions are ready, then hardened off gradually, exposed to outdoor conditions in increasing increments over about a week before being moved outside permanently. Succession planting is another professional technique especially well suited to containers. Rather than planting an entire container of radishes or lettuce at once, planting a portion every 2 weeks provides a continuous, staggered harvest, rather than one large glut followed by nothing. Season extension tools like row covers, cold frames, or simply moving containers to a sheltered wall or indoors overnight allow container gardeners to push both ends of the growing season further than in-ground gardeners typically can, which is one of the underrated superpowers of growing in movable pots. Climate and setting. Considerations. Rooftop and balcony containers often experience a heat island effect from surrounding concrete and reflective surfaces, meaning they may warm up earlier in spring, but also experience more intense heat stress in midsummer than ground-level gardens. Timing decisions should account for this microclimate rather than generic regional advice alone. Indoor container gardens under grow lights can largely ignore outdoor seasonal timing altogether, though even indoor plants often benefit from a period of reduced light and cooler temperatures that mimics a natural winter dormancy, especially for perennial herbs and dwarf fruit trees. Frequently asked questions. Can you fix a badly timed planting mid-season? Sometimes, cool season greens that bolted can often be cut back hard and may produce a second, though smaller, flush before true summer heat sets in. But warm season crops planted too early rarely recover their full potential and are often better restarted. Mistake 1. Choosing plants that are unsuitable for containers. We've saved this one for last, and for good reason. This is, more than any other single decision, the mistake responsible for the largest number of container gardening disappointments across every skill level, from the first-time balcony gardener to the experienced backyard grower trying containers for the first time. Everything else on this list, watering, feeding, light, timing, pests, pruning, can be executed with near-perfect skill, and still the garden will fail if the plant itself was simply never suited to life in a pot. Building the case. Why this mistake is so devastating. Here's the real secret that separates consistently successful container gardeners from everyone else. A container is not simply a smaller garden bed. It is a fundamentally different growing environment with different physics, and the plant world did not evolve with containers in mind. Every plant species has, over thousands or millions of years, adapted a root architecture suited to a particular natural environment. Some send taproots several feet down in search of deep groundwater. Some spread wide, shallow root mats to capture surface moisture across a large area. And some need specific companion soil fungi networks that simply cannot exist in a small, isolated volume of potting mix. When a gardener chooses a plant whose natural root architecture is fundamentally incompatible with the volume, depth, or shape of a container, no amount of skillful watering or fertilizing can fully compensate. This is why so many beginners feel like they're doing everything right and still watch a plant struggle because the plant was working against the container's basic physical limitations from the very first day it was planted. The horticultural science of root restriction. When a plant's root system reaches the wall of its container, it doesn't simply stop growing, it responds. Roots begin to circle around the container's interior wall, a phenomenon called root girdling, or becoming pot-bound. Over time, This circular growth pattern can become severe enough that roots begin to strangle each other and even choke the base of the plant's own stem, restricting the vascular flow of water and nutrients even after the plant is eventually moved to a larger container or the ground. This has cascading effects throughout the plant. Restricted roots mean a restricted capacity to take up both water and the mineral nutrients dissolved in that water. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and the micronutrients needed for enzyme function throughout the plant. A pot-bound plant often shows symptoms that look exactly like a nutrient deficiency or drought stress, leading many gardeners to the wrong diagnosis entirely. They add more fertilizer or more water to a plant whose real problem is that its roots physically cannot access what's already there. Common myths and beginner misconceptions. One of the most persistent myths is that any vegetable can be grown in a container if the container is big enough. This is only partially true, and it obscures a more important truth. Size is necessary, but not always sufficient. A full-sized, indeterminate tomato variety, like a Cherokee Purple or Brandywine, can technically survive in an enormous container, but many gardeners underestimate exactly how enormous, often 20 to 25 gallons or more, and end up with a chronically stressed plant in something closer to 5 or 10 gallons, a size better suited to determinate or dwarf varieties. Another common misconception involves root vegetables. Many beginners assume carrots grow poorly in containers because carrots need deep ground soil, when the real issue is almost always container depth and soil density, not containers as a category. A long, tapered carrot variety planted in a shallow 6-inch container will inevitably grow stunted, forked, or twisted. Not because carrots dislike containers, but because that particular variety was mismatched to that particular container's depth. Choosing a shorter, rounder carrot variety, bred specifically for shallow soil, solves this completely. A third widespread myth involves fruit trees. Many beginners assume any fruit tree will eventually adapt to container life if pruned aggressively enough. In reality, only trees grafted onto dwarfing rootstock, root systems specifically bred to stay compact, are truly suited to long-term container life. A standard rootstock citrus or apple tree crammed into a container will spend years fighting its own genetic growth potential, resulting in a permanently stressed, disease-prone plant, regardless of pruning effort. Practical, container-suited plant choices. Understanding this principle transforms plant selection from guesswork into strategy. For tomatoes, determinate and dwarf varieties bred specifically for container life, often marketed as patio or bush varieties, have naturally compact root systems that thrive in 5 to 10 gallon containers, compared to the 20+ gallons an indeterminate variety truly needs. For peppers and eggplants, most varieties are naturally well suited to containers as small as 3 to 5 gallons, since their root architecture evolved to be more compact to begin with. For beans, bush varieties outperform pole varieties in containers, unless a sturdy trellis system is built in from the start. For cucumbers, compact or bush cucumber varieties, bred for small space growing dramatically, outperform sprawling vining types in anything smaller than a very large container with trellising. For blueberries, container growing is not only possible, but often ideal, because blueberries naturally have shallow, fibrous root systems and actually prefer the more easily controlled acidic soil conditions a container allows, compared to unpredictable garden soil pH. For strawberries, their naturally shallow, spreading root systems make them nearly perfect container candidates, which is part of why strawberry towers and hanging baskets have become so popular. For citrus and other dwarf fruit trees, choosing genuinely dwarf or semi-dwarf grafted rootstock is non-negotiable for long-term container success. advanced techniques for managing root restriction. Even with well-chosen plants, professional growers use several techniques to manage the realities of root restriction over time. Root pruning. Carefully trimming the outer inch or so of a root ball during repotting can be done on certain perennial container plants and dwarf fruit trees to prevent severe girdling, encouraging the plant to regenerate finer, more efficient feeder roots rather than continuing to circle. Uppotting gradually, moving a plant into a container only modestly larger than its current one, rather than jumping to a dramatically larger size, helps prevent the wet feet problem, where a small root system in a large volume of soil can't take up water fast enough, leaving excess moisture sitting in the soil and inviting root rot. Choosing the right container material also interacts directly with root health. Terracotta and fabric grow bags allow air and moisture to move through their walls, which naturally air prunes roots that reach the edge, encouraging branching rather than tight circular girdling. Plastic and glazed ceramic containers don't offer this benefit, so root health in those containers depends more heavily on the gardener's own maintenance routine, including periodically checking the root ball during repotting. Seasonal and setting-specific considerations for mistake 1. Balcony and rooftop gardeners face an additional layer of this decision. Weight. A properly sized 20-gallon container of moist potting soil for an indeterminate tomato can weigh well over 150 pounds once fully watered, which matters enormously for structural load limits on balconies and rooftops. This is a compelling, practical reason balcony gardeners in particular benefit from deliberately choosing dwarf and compact varieties, not just for root health, but for structural safety. Indoor container gardening introduces its own version of this mistake, choosing sun-hungry, large root system vegetables for indoor growing without adequate light or root volume. When compact herbs, leafy greens, and dwarf pepper varieties bred specifically for indoor and windowsill growing will vastly outperform ambitious full-sized vegetables indoors. Patio gardens, often benefiting from a bit more ground-level stability and sometimes partial in-ground placement of containers, offer slightly more flexibility for larger containers and larger plant choices than balconies or rooftops, but the fundamental root architecture principle still applies regardless of setting. Frequently asked questions. Is it ever acceptable to grow a naturally large plant in a smaller container? Occasionally, and skilled growers do this deliberately through a technique sometimes compared to bonsai principles, deliberately restricting root space to limit overall plant size. But this requires expert-level monitoring of water and nutrients, and is not a strategy beginners should rely on for productive vegetables. What's the single most important factor to check before buying a plant for container growing? Look specifically for language on the plant tag or seed packet, indicating container, patio, dwarf, bush, or compact. These are not marketing terms, but genuine horticultural distinctions, describing root architecture bred specifically for confined growing. By understanding this one principle, that a container is a different environment requiring root-compatible plant choices, not simply a smaller version of the ground, viewers gain the single most transformative piece of knowledge in all of container gardening. Every other mistake on this list becomes dramatically easier to avoid once the right plant is growing in the right container from day one. Container gardening, at its heart, isn't about luck, and it isn't about having a naturally green thumb. It's about understanding what's actually happening beneath the soil line and inside every leaf. The way roots move, the way water travels, the way a plant allocates its limited energy between survival, growth, and reproduction. Every mistake we've walked through in this documentary, from overwatering to poor plant
Growing your own
selection,
food is
comes
a
down
dream.
to the same underlying truth. Plants are responding logically and predictably to the conditions we give them. That means every
Potting
single
mix is
struggle
light
you've
and
experienced
fluffy,
in your
but
own
garden
container
soil is
garden
dense and
wasn't a
From
personal
grow bags
failure.
to terracotta,
It was information.
explore the best systems
A wilting
for your
tomato, a bolting lettuce, a pot-bound root ball, or a plant honestly reporting
do
its
some plants
conditions back
thrive
to
while
you.
others struggle?
Once you learn to read those signals, gardening stops feeling like a gamble and starts
I just
feeling like
don't
a
get it.
conversation. If you're
The
just
roots look
starting
healthy.
out, know that every experienced gardener you've ever admired killed plants on the way to getting good at this. That's not a consolation. It's simply how the skill is built. And if you've been growing for years already, there's always another layer of understanding to unlock, another technique to refine, another season to do just a little better than the last. Wherever you're growing, a single herb pot on a kitchen windowsill, a cluster of vegetable containers on a balcony, or a full rooftop garden, the plants in front of you are capable of thriving. You now have the understanding to help them do exactly that. Final thoughts. If you found this documentary valuable, please give it a thumbs up. It genuinely helps this kind of in-depth gardening content reach more people who need it. Subscribe for more detailed container gardening documentaries and practical growing guides. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these mistakes have you made? And which lesson in this video hit home the most? If you know a friend or family member who's into container gardening, consider sharing this with them. It might save their season. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We wish you a healthy, abundant, and deeply rewarding container gardening journey ahead.